They called it the loneliest stretch of road in America until they started counting the bodies. Every mile marker became a grave marker, and the killer was just getting started. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where every story runs darker and truth cuts colder than fiction. I'm so glad you're here. Wherever you're watching from, you're part of this family. These stories are made for those who crave truth in the quiet hours. A simple like, comment, or subscribe helps them travel farther and keeps the truth alive. So, have you subscribed yet? I'm waiting. Done? Great, thank you. I want you to know that every click and comment counts, and you are very important and highly welcomed here. This is the story of the Highway of Death. We're about to walk the asphalt graveyard where a predator turned 60 miles of wilderness highway into his personal hunting ground. This is the story of the Highway of Death, where travelers vanished into thin air, where rest stops became kill zones, and where one man's twisted appetite for murder transformed a quiet Canadian road into a corridor of unspeakable horror. What you're about to hear isn't just about the victims who disappeared along this forsaken stretch of pavement. It's about the monster who waited in the shadows, the families who never stopped searching, and the detectives who finally unraveled one of North America's most chilling serial killer cases. This is the Highway of Death, and tonight we're driving straight into the darkness. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, relax, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Highway 16 cuts through British Columbia like a scar across the flesh of the wilderness. This ribbon of cracked asphalt stretches from Prince George to Prince Rupert, slicing through 450 miles of dense forest, isolated communities, and suffocating emptiness. The locals have another name for it, the Highway of Tears. But what most people don't know is that this road harbors an even darker secret. A tale so disturbing that it makes the Highway of Tears look like a prelude to something far more sinister. The year was 1969, and the counterculture movement was sweeping across North America. Young people were hitchhiking coast to coast, seeking adventure, freedom, and a break from the constraints of traditional society. Highway 16 became a lifeline for those without cars, a necessary risk for indigenous communities with limited transportation options, and a hunting ground for something evil that had just begun to stir. Roxanne Thiara was 19 years old when she disappeared. She had the kind of smile that could light up a room, dark hair that cascaded past her shoulders, and dreams bigger than the small town she called home. On July 1st, she told her family she was heading to a friend's house in Smithers, just a short journey along the highway. She packed a small bag, kissed her mother goodbye, and stepped out into the summer sun. That was the last time anyone who loved her saw her alive. When Roxanne didn't arrive at her destination, her family assumed she'd changed her plans. Young people were unpredictable in those days, free-spirited and spontaneous. But when days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, the gnawing fear in their stomachs transformed into a waking nightmare. Roxanne had simply vanished, swallowed whole by the vast wilderness that surrounded Highway 16. She wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. Delphine Nicol was 16 when she vanished in June 1990. She was hitchhiking from Smithers to Telkwa, a distance of barely 15 miles. It should have been a quick trip, an easy ride from someone heading the same direction. Instead, Delphine stepped into a vehicle and disappeared from the face of the earth. No body, no witnesses, no answers. Just another name added to the growing list of the missing. Ramona Wilson was also 16. In June 1994, she was last seen hitchhiking near Smithers. Her body was discovered a year later in the woods near the Smithers airport. Her remains so decomposed that determining a cause of death became nearly impossible. But investigators knew one thing with absolute certainty. Someone had murdered her and dumped her body like garbage in the forest. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Young women, many of them indigenous, were disappearing along this desolate stretch of highway with terrifying regularity. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and dreamers whose lives were cut short by a predator who moved through the wilderness like a ghost. Alicia Germain was just 15 years old in June 1994 when she too vanished after hitchhiking from Prince George. Her body was found in the woods near Tabor Mountain, beaten and discarded. The autopsy revealed she had suffered tremendously before death finally released her from her torment. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police began to see connections, threads of evidence that suggested these weren't isolated incidents but the work of one or more serial killers who had turned Highway 16 into their personal killing field. But the investigation faced obstacles at every turn. The vast wilderness made searching for bodies nearly impossible. The remote nature of the highway meant few witnesses, and the transient nature of hitchhiking meant that victims often got into vehicles without anyone seeing who was driving. Monica Ignaz, Jack Family, and Maureen Mosi all disappeared in the 1970s along the same stretch of highway. Each case grew cold almost as quickly as it opened. The families pleaded for answers, organized searches, and put up missing person posters that would fade in the sun and rain, their faces becoming ghostly reminders of lives stolen. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn, where we move from the highway of tears into an even more sinister realm. While investigators were focused on Highway 16, another pattern was emerging, one that would eventually connect to one of the most prolific serial killers in Canadian history. Robert Pickton owned a pig farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. To the casual observer, it was just another rural property, complete with the expected sights, sounds, and smells of agricultural life. But beneath the ordinary facade, Pickton's farm was concealing a house of horrors that would eventually shock the world. Throughout the 1990s, women began disappearing from Vancouver's downtown east side at an alarming rate. These were vulnerable women, many struggling with addiction, working in survival sex work, living on society's margins. They were the kind of people who could disappear without making headlines, without sparking massive investigations, without the public outcry that should accompany every missing person case. Pickton would cruise the streets of Vancouver, targeting women he knew would be easy prey. He would offer them money, drugs, or simply a ride, and they would climb into his vehicle, desperate and unaware they were entering the clutches of a monster. He would drive them back to his pig farm, where he would torture, murder, and dispose of their bodies with calculated efficiency. The connection to Highway 16 came through the realization that Pickton hadn't limited his hunting ground to Vancouver. Evidence would later suggest that he had traveled along various highways, including Highway 16, in search of victims. His modus operandi fit the profile of the highway of death killer perfectly, targeting vulnerable women, often indigenous, who were hitchhiking or could easily be lured into vehicles. But even as the body count climbed, even as more women disappeared, the investigation moved at a glacial pace. Indigenous women's lives were not valued the same as others, a brutal truth that hung over every missing person report, every cold case file, every family left without answers. The systemic racism embedded in Canadian law enforcement meant that cases involving Indigenous victims were often given lower priority, investigated with less vigor, and solved at depressingly low rates. Sarah DeVries kept a diary. In her writings, she documented her life on the streets, her struggles with addiction, and her growing fear that a serial killer was hunting women in Vancouver. In one chilling entry, she wrote about her certainty that she would be next, that her life would end at the hands of a predator, and that no one would care enough to find her killer. In April 1998, Sarah disappeared. Her remains would eventually be found on Pickton's farm, her worst fears realized in the most horrific way possible. The families of the missing refused to give up. They organized vigils, demanded police action, and kept the stories of their loved ones alive when it seemed the rest of the world wanted to forget. Wayne Lung lost his sister Serena Abotsway to Pickton's bloodlust. He became one of the most vocal advocates for the missing and murdered women, refusing to let their names fade into obscurity. Back on Highway 16, the disappearances continued. In 1994, Roxanne Thiara's remains were finally found, years after she had vanished. The discovery brought some closure to her family but opened up more questions. How many more bodies were hidden in the vast forests? How many killers were operating along this highway? And why had it taken so long for anyone to connect the dots? Cody Leachbokoff was born in 1990, the same year Delphine Nickel disappeared. He grew up in the area surrounding Highway 16, a quiet kid who seemed unremarkable to those who knew him. But behind his ordinary facade lurked something dark, something twisted, something that would eventually reveal him as one of Canada's youngest serial killers. His story would intersect with the highway of death in ways that would prove just how many predators had been stalking that lonely stretch of road. February 22, 2002, marked the day the truth began clawing its way out of the earth on Robert Pickton's pig farm. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police executed a search warrant on the property, initially looking for illegal firearms. What they found instead was a crime scene so horrific, so unthinkably depraved, that even seasoned homicide detectives struggled to process the magnitude of evil that had occurred on those 17 acres. The search began in the morning mist, officers spreading across the property with growing unease. The farm itself was a chaotic mess of dilapidated buildings, rusting equipment, and mud that seemed to swallow your boots with each step. But it was what lay beneath and within this disorder that would haunt investigators for the rest of their lives. In one of the outbuildings, officers discovered personal belongings, purses, identification cards, jewelry, items that had no business being on a pig farm. Each piece represented a woman who had vanished from Vancouver's streets, and with each new discovery, the scope of Pickton's crimes became more apparent. This wasn't just a murder investigation. This was an excavation of a mass grave. Sergeant Don Adam led the task force, and he knew within hours of arriving on the property that they were dealing with one of the worst serial killer cases in Canadian history. The farm would need to be processed as one massive crime scene, every inch of soil potentially containing evidence of murder. The RCMP brought in anthropologists, forensic specialists, and heavy equipment. They would spend months digging through the property, sifting through soil, searching through the pig pens, examining every structure. The discoveries came in waves of mounting horror. Human remains were found mixed with animal bones. DNA evidence was extracted from the soil itself. Personal effects belonging to dozens of missing women emerged from the earth like accusations. Pickton had been killing for years, possibly decades, using his pig farm as both hunting ground and disposal site. The forensic team discovered that Pickton had been feeding human remains to his pigs, a method of disposal so disturbing that it seemed ripped from the darkest horror fiction. But this was real. These were real women, real lives, real families who would now have to live with the knowledge of what had happened to their loved ones. Dinah Taylor had disappeared in 2001. Her DNA was found on the farm. Inga Hall vanished in 1998. Her remains were discovered in the soil. Brenda Wolfe went missing in 1999. Fragments of her body were recovered during the excavation. The list grew longer each day, each name a devastating confirmation that another family's worst fears had come true. But Pickton hadn't worked alone in his depravity. Evidence suggested he had hosted parties at the farm, inviting friends and associates who may have been aware of his crimes. Some testimony would later indicate that Pickton had bragged about his murders, claiming he had killed 49 women and was disappointed he hadn't made it to 50. Whether this boast was accurate or the grandiose claim of a narcissistic killer remains uncertain, but the confirmed victim count was devastating enough. The trial of Robert Pickton began in January 2007, and it would become one of the longest and most expensive prosecutions in Canadian history. The Crown charged him with 27 counts of first-degree murder, though the trial would only proceed with 6 cases initially, chosen because they had the strongest forensic evidence. The courtroom testimony was brutal. Forensic pathologists described finding women's remains mixed with pig tissue. DNA specialists explained how they had matched genetic material from the farm to missing women. Survivors testified about their encounters with Pickton, narrow escapes from a man who had planned to add them to his victim count. One woman, whose identity remains protected, testified that Pickton had handcuffed her and attempted to murder her at the farm in 1997. She had fought for her life, managing to stab Pickton with his own knife before escaping into the night. She had reported the assault to police, but incredibly, the investigation had stalled, and Pickton had remained free to continue killing. This revelation sparked outrage and raised serious questions about how many women might have been saved if police had acted more decisively. The defense attempted to argue that Pickton had not acted alone, that others had committed the actual murders while Pickton had merely disposed of the bodies. The strategy was transparent: create reasonable doubt by suggesting alternative suspects. But the evidence against Pickton was overwhelming. His DNA was found mixed with victims' blood. His property contained the remains. Witnesses placed him with missing women shortly before they disappeared. On December 9, 2007, the jury delivered their verdict. Robert Pickton was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder. The conviction on second-degree rather than first-degree murder charges sparked controversy, as it implied the jury believed Pickton had not fully planned the murders. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The remaining 20 murder charges were stayed by the Crown in 2010, a decision that devastated many families who felt their loved ones had been denied justice. The prosecutors argued that, with Pickton already serving the maximum sentence, proceeding with additional trials would be unnecessarily expensive and traumatic without changing the outcome. But Pickton's connection to the highway of death remained murky. Investigators knew he had traveled extensively throughout British Columbia. His brother David owned property near Highway 16. Witnesses reported seeing Robert Pickton in areas along the highway during periods when women disappeared. But proving he was responsible for specific highway of death disappearances proved difficult with the passage of time and degradation of evidence. The families of the missing women from Highway 16 watched the Pickton trial with mixed emotions. Some hoped it would bring answers about their loved ones. Others feared that even if Pickton was responsible for some highway of death murders, he would take that information to his grave, leaving them without closure. The investigation into Pickton's crimes also revealed systemic failures within law enforcement that had allowed him to kill for so long. The missing persons reports for downtown Eastside women had been treated with insufficient urgency. Tips about Pickton had been received years before his arrest but not adequately investigated. The racism and classism that devalued the lives of Indigenous women and sex workers had created an environment where a serial killer could operate with impunity. Lynn Frey's sister Marnie disappeared in 1997. When Lynn tried to report her sister missing, police suggested Marnie had probably just moved away without telling anyone. This dismissive attitude was common, a pattern that repeated itself with nearly every missing woman. Their lifestyle, their struggles with addiction, their work in the sex trade. All of these factors led police to assume they had simply left rather than considering they might have been victims of violence. The public inquiry that followed Pickton's conviction examined these failures in detail. Commissioner Wally Oppel's report concluded that police had exhibited blatant failures in their investigation and that systemic bias against sex workers and Indigenous women had contributed to Pickton's ability to kill for years without detection. But while the world focused on Robert Pickton and his pig farm of horrors, other predators continued to hunt along Highway 16. The attention on Pickton had cast a spotlight on serial murder in British Columbia, but it had also obscured the fact that the highway of death was not the work of a single killer. Multiple predators had discovered the vulnerability of women traveling along that isolated road, and they had exploited it with ruthless efficiency. Madison Scott was 20 years old when she disappeared in May 2011, years after Pickton's arrest. She had been camping with friends at Hogsback Lake, near Vanderhoof, just off Highway 16. When her friends woke in the morning, Madison was gone. Her truck remained at the campsite, her tent was still standing, but Madison had vanished as if she had never existed. Despite extensive searches, despite media attention, despite her family's desperate pleas, Madison has never been found. Loren Leslie was just 15 years old, and her story would finally crack open another dark chapter in the Highway of Death saga. In November 2010, her body was discovered in a gravel pit near Prince George. She had been brutally murdered, and the investigation into her death would lead police to a predator they hadn't even known was hunting. Cody Leijbokoff looked like the boy next door. At 20 years old, he had an easy smile, worked at a local oil company, and seemed to blend into the community of Prince George without drawing any particular attention. Nobody suspected that beneath his unremarkable exterior lurked one of Canada's youngest serial killers, a predator who had already claimed multiple victims before he was old enough to legally drink alcohol in the United States. November 27, 2010, started as a routine patrol for RCMP officers in Prince George. A pickup truck was driving erratically on Highway 27, weaving between lanes in a manner suggesting an impaired driver. The officers pulled the vehicle over, expecting a standard DUI arrest. Instead, they stumbled onto a fresh crime scene that would unravel one of the most disturbing cases in British Columbia's history. The driver was Cody Leachbokoff, and he appeared nervous, his hands shaking as he produced his license. Officers noticed blood on his chin and shirt, still wet and fresh. When asked about the blood, Leachbokoff claimed he had hit a deer and gone to check on it. But something about his demeanor, his story, and the amount of blood visible set off alarm bells for the experienced officers. A quick search of the area where Leachbokoff claimed to have hit a deer revealed no animal carcass. Instead, hidden in the brush just off the forestry road, officers discovered the body of Loren Leslie. She was 15 years old, and she had been murdered with savage brutality. Her throat had been slashed, and she had been bludgeoned with a pipe wrench. The attack had been frenzied, personal, and horrifically violent. Leachbokoff was arrested immediately, but he maintained his innocence, claiming he had discovered the body and gotten blood on him while checking to see if the person was still alive. His story was weak, contradictory, and fell apart under even minimal scrutiny. But what investigators didn't yet realize was that Loren Leslie was not Leachbokoff's first victim. She was his fourth. The forensic examination of Leachbokoff's apartment revealed evidence that would horrify even the most hardened investigators. Hidden in his possession were items belonging to 3 other women who had vanished from the Prince George area: Jill Stachenko, Cynthia Moss, and Natasha Montgomery. Each woman had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and each disappearance had been investigated as a separate missing person case. Nobody had connected them until Leachbokoff's arrest forced investigators to look deeper. Jill Stachenko was 35 years old when she disappeared in October 2009. She had struggled with addiction and had been working in the sex trade to support herself. On October 9th, she was last seen in downtown Prince George. Her body was discovered in a gravel pit on October 26th, partially covered with debris in a shallow grave. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma. She had been beaten to death and discarded like trash. When investigators searched Leachbokoff's residence, they found Jill's identification, personal items, and most damning of all, a tool belonging to Leachbokoff that had microscopic traces of Jill's blood. He had kept trophies from his kill, souvenirs that fed whatever dark compulsion drove him to murder. Cynthia Moss was 35 years old and also struggling with addiction when she disappeared in September 2010. Like Jill, she had been working in survival sex work, vulnerable and largely invisible to society. Her remains were discovered in a park in Prince George on October 1, 2010. She had been dead for weeks, and the decomposition made determining an exact cause of death difficult. But the violence inflicted upon her was evident even in her skeletal remains. Leachbokoff had kept Cynthia's belongings as well, hiding them in his apartment like macabre prizes. He had hunted these women, murdered them, and then returned to his normal life as if nothing had happened. He went to work, socialized with friends, maintained relationships, all while hiding the fact that he had become a serial killer before his 21st birthday. Natasha Montgomery was 23 years old when she vanished in September 2010, just weeks before Leachbokoff's arrest. Unlike Jill and Cynthia, Natasha was not involved in sex work. She was a young mother, struggling to get her life together, and her disappearance devastated her family. Despite extensive searches, Natasha's body has never been found, but evidence in Leachbokoff's possession, including her identification and personal items, confirmed he had murdered her. The trial of Cody Leachbokoff began in September 2014, and it revealed the disturbing psychology of a young man who had developed a taste for killing. The Crown argued that Leachbokoff was a sexual sadist who targeted vulnerable women because they were easy prey. He would lure them with offers of money or drugs, drive them to isolated locations, and then unleash savage violence upon them. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Blood evidence in Lejbokov's truck matched all 4 victims. His DNA was found on the victims' bodies and clothing. The murder weapon, a pipe wrench, was recovered from his vehicle with traces of Loren Leslie's blood and tissue. The trophies he had kept, identification cards, jewelry, personal items, were cataloged and entered into evidence. But perhaps most chilling was Lejbokov's own testimony when he finally decided to take the stand. He admitted to being present when each woman died but claimed he had not killed them. According to his version of events, he had been with various friends who had actually committed the murders while he watched. He claimed he had helped dispose of bodies and kept items from the crime scenes but was not the actual killer. The defense's strategy was transparent: admit to being involved to explain away the forensic evidence, but deny being the murderer to avoid the most serious charges. The jury didn't believe him. The evidence showed he had acted alone, that he had developed his murderous pattern independently, and that he had grown increasingly bold with each kill. Dr. Tracy Trothen, a forensic psychiatrist who examined Lejbokov, testified that he exhibited characteristics consistent with sexual sadism and antisocial personality disorder. He had a complete lack of empathy for his victims, viewing them as objects to be used and discarded rather than as human beings with lives, families, and value. On September 11, 2014, Cody Lejbokov was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. At 24 years old, he became one of Canada's youngest convicted serial killers. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The judge described the murders as calculated and callous, and noted that Lejbokov had shown no genuine remorse for his actions. The revelation that such a young man had committed multiple murders shocked the Prince George community. Parents who had known Lejbokov in school struggled to reconcile the polite teenager they remembered with the monster he had become. But those who study serial killers were not surprised. Many serial killers begin their murderous careers in their late teens or early 20s, and Lejbokov fit that pattern perfectly. The investigation into Lejbokov's crimes also raised questions about how many other victims there might be. He had been actively killing for at least a year before his arrest, possibly longer. He was mobile, had access to vehicles, and frequently traveled throughout northern British Columbia. Could he have been responsible for other unsolved disappearances along Highway 16? Investigators looked for connections between Lejbokov and the earlier Highway of Death cases, but the timing didn't align for most of them. He would have been too young to have been involved in the murders of women who disappeared in the 1990s and early 2000s. However, his case proved something critical. Highway 16 continued to be a hunting ground for predators, and multiple killers had independently discovered its potential. The families of the Highway of Death victims watched Lejbokov's trial with mixed emotions. Some hoped he might provide information about other missing women, but he never did. Others saw his conviction as proof that police were finally taking the murders of vulnerable women seriously, though that attention had come far too late for their loved ones. Gladys Rodek, whose niece Tamara Chipman disappeared in 2005 along Highway 16, became one of the most prominent activists calling for justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women. She organized annual walks along Highway 16, gathering families and supporters to raise awareness and demand action. The walks became powerful demonstrations of the community's refusal to let these women be forgotten. The Highway of Death had claimed dozens of victims over decades, and the investigations had revealed multiple predators. Robert Pickton, with his pig farm horror show and his possible Highway 16 connections. Cody Lejbokov, proving that new monsters were still emerging, and potentially others who have never been caught, killers who continue to evade justice. Highway 16 stretches through the darkness, an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through wilderness that seems to swallow light itself. Even now, decades after the first disappearances, the road maintains its sinister reputation. Locals avoid hitchhiking, parents warn their children, and communities along the route remain vigilant, knowing that evil has walked this highway before and may walk it again. The official count of Highway of Death victims varies depending on which cases investigators include, but conservative estimates place the number at over 40 women who have vanished or been murdered along this route since 1969. Some estimates go much higher, suggesting that as many as 80 women may have fallen prey to predators hunting this isolated stretch of road. The true number may never be known. In 2005, the RCMP launched Project EPANA, a specialized task force dedicated to investigating the highway of death cases. The acronym stands for Ending Predatory Alien Attacks, though the slightly awkward naming belies the serious purpose of the operation. Project EPANA reviewed every missing person case along Highway 16, looking for connections, patterns, and evidence that might have been missed in earlier investigations. The task force confirmed what families and activists had been saying for years. Systemic failures had allowed these crimes to continue for decades. Reports of missing Indigenous women had been treated as low priority. Investigations had been underfunded and understaffed. Evidence had been lost or contaminated. Witnesses had not been adequately interviewed. The racism embedded in Canadian society had created an environment where vulnerable women could disappear without the urgency and resources that should accompany every missing person case. Project EPANA identified several persons of interest, individuals who had the means, opportunity, and potential motive to commit some of the highway of death murders. But identifying suspects and proving their guilt are two different things, and the passage of time had made gathering evidence increasingly difficult. Bobby Jack Fowler emerged as one of the primary suspects in several highway of death cases. Fowler was an American drifter and convicted sex offender who had traveled extensively through the Pacific Northwest during the 1970s and 1980s. He had a documented history of violence against women, and his timeline placed him in British Columbia during periods when several women disappeared along Highway 16. Fowler died in prison in Oregon in 2006, taking any secrets he possessed to the grave. But DNA evidence later connected him to the 1974 murder of Colleen Macmillan, a 16-year-old who had been hitchhiking near Highway 16 when she disappeared. Her body was found in February 1975, and for decades, her murder remained unsolved. The DNA match to Fowler proved he had killed at least one highway of death victim, and investigators believe he may have been responsible for several others. But Fowler could not have been responsible for all the highway of death murders. The timeline doesn't work, and the variations in method suggest multiple offenders. This realization led to a chilling conclusion. Highway 16 had attracted numerous serial predators over the decades, each discovering independently that this isolated route offered easy access to vulnerable victims. Curtis Wayne Myers was another person of interest investigated by Project EPANA. Myers was a trucker who had regularly traveled Highway 16 during the 1990s and early 2000s. Multiple witnesses reported seeing women getting into a vehicle matching the description of Myers' truck shortly before they disappeared. But despite circumstantial evidence suggesting his involvement, police never gathered enough concrete proof to charge him with murder. The difficulty in solving highway of death cases stems from several factors. The vast wilderness surrounding Highway 16 makes searching for bodies nearly impossible. The remote nature of the area means few witnesses to crimes. Many victims were transient or marginalized, making it difficult to establish precise timelines of their movements. And the sheer number of potential suspects, any man who regularly traveled the highway during the relevant time periods, made narrowing the investigation challenging. Nicole Hoare's disappearance in 2002 brought unprecedented media attention to the highway of death. Unlike many of the earlier victims, Nicole was a white woman from a middle-class family, a tree planter who had been hitchhiking from Prince George to Smithers to visit her sister. Her case received extensive news coverage, and her family had the resources to organize large-scale searches and keep public attention focused on finding her. Nicole's family struggled with the painful reality that their daughter's case was receiving attention that so many Indigenous families had been denied. They used their platform to advocate for all highway of death victims, recognizing that systemic racism had meant some lives were valued more than others by both media and law enforcement. Despite the attention, despite the searches, despite the years of investigation, Nicole Hoare has never been found. Her disappearance remains one of the most high-profile unsolved cases along Highway 16, a reminder that even with resources and media attention, the highway keeps its secrets. The investigation into Bobby Jack Fowler's potential involvement in highway of death cases revealed another disturbing pattern: the interconnectedness of serial predators across North America. Fowler had committed crimes in multiple states before entering Canada. He had evaded justice for years by constantly moving, exploiting the lack of communication between different law enforcement jurisdictions. Similarly, investigators discovered that other persons of interest in highway of death cases had committed crimes in multiple provinces and states. The transient nature of truckers, drifters, and construction workers who traveled Highway 16 for work meant that suspects could commit murders in British Columbia and then disappear into the vastness of North America, making tracking them nearly impossible with the investigative tools available in earlier decades. Modern forensic techniques have offered new hope for solving cold highway of death cases. DNA technology has advanced dramatically since the 1970s and 1980s, and evidence that was useless decades ago can now yield crucial information. Genealogical DNA databases have helped police identify suspects in cold cases across North America, and investigators are hopeful these tools might eventually crack some of the highway of death mysteries. But DNA only helps if you have biological evidence to test, and many highway of death victims' remains have never been found. The bodies that were discovered decades ago were often so decomposed that collecting viable DNA was impossible with the technology available at the time. In some cases, evidence was lost, contaminated, or destroyed over the years, making retrospective analysis impossible. The families continue to search, to hope, and to demand justice. The annual Walk for Justice along Highway 16 has become a powerful symbol of the community's refusal to forget the missing and murdered women. Every year, families gather to walk a portion of the highway, carrying pictures of their loved ones, sharing their stories, and demanding that authorities continue investigating these crimes. The walk is both a memorial and a protest, honoring the dead while challenging the systemic failures that allowed so many women to disappear without adequate investigation or public outcry. Participants carry signs with the names and faces of the missing, ensuring that these women are remembered as individuals, not just statistics in a criminal investigation. The Canadian government has responded to the outcry over missing and murdered Indigenous women by launching a national inquiry in 2016. The inquiry heard testimony from families, survivors, experts, and activists about the systemic issues that have made Indigenous women disproportionately vulnerable to violence. The final report, released in 2019, concluded that the disappearances and murders of Indigenous women constitute genocide, a term that sparked controversy but reflected the deliberate nature of societal failures that had allowed these crimes to continue. But inquiries and reports, no matter how well-intentioned, do not bring back the dead or ease the pain of families who have spent decades without answers. For the mothers who still set a place at the table for daughters who will never come home, for the siblings who watch their parents grow old while still waiting for closure, for the children who grew up without their mothers, the investigations and reports are cold comfort. Some cases have seen resolution in recent years. In 2021, Alan Scheibach was convicted of murdering Lisa Marie Young, who disappeared in 2002 after leaving a nightclub in Nanaimo. While not technically a Highway 16 case, the similarities to the highway of death murders were striking. A vulnerable young woman, a predatory man, and systemic failures in the initial investigation that allowed the killer to evade justice for nearly 2 decades. Each conviction, each identification of remains, each answer discovered brings hope that more families might eventually learn what happened to their loved ones. But it also underscores the tragedy of how many years were lost, how many leads went cold, and how many killers evaded justice for far too long. The highway of death remains operational, of course. Cars and trucks still travel its length every day, carrying people to work, to visit family, to start new chapters of their lives. But the ghosts linger along that road, invisible passengers reminding travelers of the lives lost and the families left behind. Modern travelers on Highway 16 will see billboards and memorials dedicated to missing women. Rest stops feature information about staying safe and reporting suspicious activity. The highway itself has been improved in some sections, with better lighting and increased patrols, though much of it remains as isolated and dangerous as ever. Indigenous communities along Highway 16 have implemented their own safety measures. Some have organized volunteer driver programs, ensuring women don't have to hitchhike to reach medical appointments or visit family. Others have installed security cameras at bus stops and along roads. These community-led initiatives have emerged from the painful recognition that they cannot rely solely on outside authorities to keep their women safe. The question that haunts investigators is how many killers are still out there. Bobby Jack Fowler is dead. Robert Pickton is in prison. Cody Leijbokoff is behind bars. But Project EPANA has identified multiple other persons of interest who have never been charged, either because evidence is insufficient or because they too have died without ever being held accountable for their crimes. The highway continues to claim attention for the wrong reasons. In 2019, Dolores Brower was found deceased near the highway. Dolores had been a vocal advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women, having lost her own daughter Ramona Wilson to the highway of death back in 1994. The cruel irony of an advocate herself falling victim to violence near the same highway that had claimed her daughter was not lost on the community. Her death, ruled a homicide, remained unsolved for years before charges were finally laid in 2022. The psychological toll on communities along Highway 16 cannot be overstated. Entire generations have grown up knowing they live along what some call Canada's killing fields. Young women are taught from childhood to never hitchhike, to always travel in groups, to carry cell phones even though reception along much of the highway remains spotty at best. The fear has become intergenerational trauma, passed from mothers to daughters, a constant awareness that the highway holds dangers beyond typical traffic accidents. Dr. Emma Cunliffe, a criminology professor who has extensively studied the highway of death cases, points to the intersection of geography, poverty, and systemic racism as creating the perfect hunting ground for predators. Indigenous communities along Highway 16 often lack adequate public transportation, forcing people to hitchhike for basic necessities like medical care, groceries, or visiting family. The isolation of these communities means help is far away when something goes wrong. And the historical devaluing of Indigenous women's lives by authorities meant that even when women went missing, the response was inadequate. The trucking industry has also faced scrutiny in connection with highway of death cases. Long-haul truckers regularly travel Highway 16, and the transient nature of their work provides both opportunity and cover for criminal activity. Several persons of interest in highway of death cases were truckers, and investigators have noted similarities between these cases and unsolved murders along other isolated highways across North America where truck routes run. Some trucking companies have implemented programs to train drivers to recognize and report signs of human trafficking or vulnerable people in dangerous situations. But critics argue these measures are insufficient and that the industry needs more stringent background checks and monitoring of drivers who have access to vulnerable populations along isolated routes. The role of law enforcement in the highway of death tragedy cannot be examined without confronting uncomfortable truths. The initial investigations were plagued by assumptions that missing women had simply moved on, that their lifestyles made them unreliable, that their cases weren't worth the resources required for thorough investigations. Officers who worked these cases have since expressed regret over missed opportunities and failures to connect obvious dots. Sergeant Kevin Hackett, who worked on several highway of death cases, admitted in a 2015 interview that police had failed the families and victims. He described how missing person reports for Indigenous women were often given lower priority, how evidence was not preserved with the care it deserved, and how the sheer volume of cases overwhelmed limited resources. His candid acknowledgement of these failures was unusual in law enforcement culture, but reflected a growing recognition that systemic change was desperately needed. The advancement of technology has provided new investigative tools, but it has also revealed how much evidence was lost or mishandled in earlier decades. Touch DNA technology can now extract genetic profiles from items that were previously thought useless for testing. Forensic genealogy has solved cold cases across North America by comparing crime scene DNA to profiles in consumer genealogy databases. Digital mapping and analysis can identify patterns invisible to earlier investigators. Project EPANA has used these modern tools to re-examine old evidence, and in some cases they have yielded new leads. But the brutal reality is that many highway of death cases are so old, the evidence so degraded or lost, that even modern forensics cannot provide answers. For those families, the hope for justice dims with each passing year. The media's role in the highway of death story has evolved over decades. In the early years, disappearances of Indigenous women along Highway 16 received minimal coverage, if any at all. It wasn't until cases involving white women like Nicole Hoare made headlines that broader public attention turned to the highway. This disparity in media coverage reflected and reinforced the societal racism that devalued Indigenous lives. Indigenous journalists and activists have worked to change this narrative, using social media and alternative news sources to share the stories of missing and murdered women that mainstream media ignored. The hashtag movement #MMIW, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, has gained international attention, forcing conversations about systemic violence against Indigenous women not just in Canada but globally. Brandy Morin, a Cree journalist who has extensively covered highway of death cases, has written about the responsibility media bears for humanizing victims and refusing to reduce them to statistics or stereotypes. Her work emphasizes the individual stories, the dreams cut short, the children left motherless, the families broken by loss, ensuring that each woman is remembered as a full, complex human being rather than just another victim in a serial killer's tally. The economic impact of the highway of death on communities along the route is substantial but difficult to quantify. Tourism has been affected, with some visitors avoiding the area due to its dark reputation. Property values in some communities have been impacted. But more significantly, the Indigenous communities have borne the cost of organizing searches, memorial events, and safety programs with limited resources, taking on responsibilities that should fall to government agencies. Some communities have established victim services and support groups for families of the missing, funded largely through donations and volunteer work. These grassroots organizations have become crucial lifelines for families navigating the trauma of having a loved one disappear, providing practical support like help with police reports, emotional support through grief counseling, and collective action through advocacy. The legal system's response to highway of death cases has been frustratingly slow and inadequate in the eyes of many families. Even when suspects have been identified, the burden of proof required for criminal conviction is high, and without bodies or strong forensic evidence, prosecutors have been unable to bring charges in many cases. This has led to situations where families know or strongly suspect who killed their loved one but watch that person walk free due to insufficient evidence. Civil lawsuits have provided some families with a measure of accountability when the criminal system failed. In 2022, the British Columbia government settled a class action lawsuit brought by families of highway of death victims, acknowledging that police had discriminated against Indigenous women in their investigations. While no amount of money can compensate for lost lives, the settlement represented official acknowledgement of the systemic failures that had allowed so many murders to go unsolved. The environmental factors that made Highway 16 so dangerous for hitchhikers remain largely unchanged. The highway still cuts through hundreds of miles of wilderness. Cell phone coverage is still spotty. Public transportation options remain limited. The isolation that made it easy for predators to attack victims and dispose of bodies still exists. Without significant infrastructure investment and improved services for remote communities, the fundamental vulnerabilities persist. Some advocates have called for a complete overhaul of how remote highways are managed in Canada, arguing that the government has a duty to ensure safe transportation for all citizens. Proposals have included establishing regular shuttle services between communities, installing emergency call boxes along isolated stretches, improving cell tower coverage, and increasing police patrols. But implementing these measures is expensive, and political will has been inconsistent. The spiritual dimension of the highway of death has been important for many Indigenous communities processing this trauma. Traditional ceremonies have been held along the highway to honor the dead, to bless the families left behind, and to cleanse the area of the violence that has occurred there. Elders have spoken about how the land itself remembers the blood spilled upon it, how the spirits of the murdered women still cry out for justice. Memorial markers have been placed along Highway 16, often at sites where bodies were discovered or where women were last seen. These markers serve multiple purposes: honoring the dead, warning travelers of the dangers, and ensuring the women are not forgotten. Some families tend these memorials regularly, leaving flowers, photographs, and personal items that weather and fade but are continually refreshed. The international attention to Canada's highway of death has drawn comparisons to similar cases worldwide. Australia has its own highway of death in the Flinders Ranges. The United States has numerous highways with disturbing numbers of unsolved murders and disappearances. Mexico's Highway 45 between Ciudad Juarez and Chihuahua has seen hundreds of women murdered or vanished. These global patterns suggest that isolated highways combined with vulnerable populations create opportunities for predators regardless of country. Criminologists studying these patterns have noted common factors. Highways that serve as major trucking or travel routes, areas with high poverty rates, regions with marginalized populations, and jurisdictions with limited law enforcement resources. The highway of death fits this profile perfectly, and understanding these patterns helps investigators identify other potential hotspots for serial predation. The future of the highway of death investigations remains uncertain. Project EPANA continues to work on unsolved cases, but with limited budgets and competing priorities, progress is slow. Some families have lost hope that they will ever learn what happened to their loved ones. Others maintain unwavering determination, continuing to pressure authorities, organize searches, and keep their loved ones' stories alive. Technological advances continue to offer possibilities. Artificial intelligence is being used to analyze patterns in cold cases, potentially identifying connections human investigators missed. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have been employed to search for burial sites along the highway. Improved DNA analysis techniques are being applied to old evidence. Each technological breakthrough brings renewed hope that answers might finally emerge. The younger generation growing up along Highway 16 carries the weight of this history. They are more connected through social media, more aware of the dangers, more vocal about demanding change. Indigenous youth have become powerful advocates, using platforms like TikTok and Instagram to share stories, organize events, and call out systemic injustices. They refuse to accept that living along this highway means accepting danger as inevitable. Educational programs have been implemented in schools along Highway 16, teaching students about personal safety, recognizing dangerous situations, and understanding their rights when interacting with police. While controversial in some quarters, critics argue these programs place the burden of safety on potential victims rather than addressing the root causes of violence. Supporters maintain that practical safety education saves lives. The Highway of Death has inspired multiple books, documentaries, podcasts, and academic studies. Each retelling of these stories serves to keep the cases in public consciousness, potentially generating new tips or encouraging witnesses to come forward. The media attention has been a double-edged sword, bringing needed awareness but sometimes sensationalizing tragedy and re-traumatizing families. Ramona Wilson's mother, Matilda, became one of the most recognized faces of the Highway of Death tragedy. For decades, she attended vigils, spoke at rallies, and demanded that police do more to solve her daughter's murder and the murders of so many others. When she passed away in 2020 without ever seeing justice for Ramona, it felt like another tragedy piled upon tragedies. But her legacy lives on in the advocacy organizations she helped build and the awareness she helped create. The highway stretches on into the darkness, that same ribbon of asphalt that has witnessed so much suffering. Tonight, as every night, cars travel its length. Some drivers are aware of the history, casting nervous glances at the forest pressing close to the road. Others are oblivious, focused on reaching their destinations without knowing the stories embedded in the very pavement beneath their tires. The truth about the Highway of Death is that it represents more than just a series of unsolved murders. It is a mirror reflecting systemic failures, societal prejudices, and the deadly consequences of devaluing certain lives. It is a testament to the families who refused to let their loved ones become forgotten statistics. It is a warning about the dangers that lurk in isolated places where predators know they can hunt with near impunity. Robert Pickton may be in prison, Cody Leachbokoff may be behind bars, and Bobby Jack Fowler may be dead. But the Highway of Death story is not finished. Other killers may still be out there, their identities unknown, their crimes unaccounted for. And until every case is solved, until every family has answers, until the systemic changes needed to prevent future tragedies are implemented, the highway will continue to live up to its dark name. The ghosts walk that road, invisible but present, their stories echoing in the wind that rushes through the trees. They are daughters and mothers, sisters and friends, each one a life with infinite potential cut short by violence. They are Roxanne and Ramona, Delphine and Monica, Jill and Cynthia, Natasha and Loren, and dozens more whose names should be remembered, whose lives should be honored, whose deaths should never be forgotten. This is the highway of death, where the pavement runs red with stories that must be told, where justice delayed has been justice denied for too long, and where the fight for answers continues with every sunrise. The road has no end, and neither does the determination of those who refuse to let these women's memories fade into the wilderness that surrounds that cursed stretch of asphalt. The highway took their lives, but it will not take their legacy. That is the promise the living have made to the dead, and it is a promise that will not be broken, no matter how many miles lie ahead. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Euro Ripper. They say evil has a face, but what if that face smiled at you in broad daylight, asked you for directions, offered to help carry your groceries? What if the monster wore the mask of normalcy so perfectly that even when blood dried under his fingernails, no one thought to look twice? There are crimes that shock us. Then there are crimes that fundamentally alter our understanding of human capacity for darkness. Between 1975 and 1992, a predator moved through Europe like a ghost, leaving a trail of mutilated bodies across multiple countries, each victim subjected to horrors that would make seasoned homicide detectives physically ill. His name was Dariusz Kotwicka, but the press would come to know him by a title that sent chills through an entire continent: the Euro Ripper. This is not a story about why evil exists. This is a forensic examination of how it hunted, how it killed, and how it almost got away with it. What you're about to hear will disturb you, because every word of it is true. The first body appeared on a Tuesday morning in October 1975, discovered by a postal worker taking a shortcut through a wooded area outside Wrocław, Poland. What he found would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The victim, later identified as 23-year-old Zofia Kowalski, had been positioned deliberately, almost ceremonially, against an oak tree. Her hands had been bound with electrical wire so tightly that it cut through to the bone. But the binding was merely a prelude to something far worse. The medical examiner's report, written in the clinical language that professionals use to distance themselves from horror, nevertheless conveyed the savagery of the attack. Zofia had been stabbed 47 times. Not in a frenzy, as one might expect from a crime of passion, but methodically. The wounds formed a pattern, each precisely placed to maximize pain while avoiding immediately fatal injuries. The killer had taken his time. He had made her suffer for hours before finally slicing her throat so deeply that her head was nearly separated from her body. The amount of blood at the scene suggested she had been alive for most of the ordeal. But it was the mutilation performed after death that truly distinguished this murder as the work of someone operating beyond the boundaries of comprehension. The killer had carved symbols into her abdomen, geometric patterns that meant nothing to investigators but clearly held significance for the perpetrator. He had removed her eyes with surgical precision, placing them carefully in her open palms as though presenting her with some grotesque gift. This detail was never released to the public. It would become the signature that connected this murder to dozens more. Dariusz Kotwicka was 27 years old when he committed his first known murder, though psychiatric evaluations conducted years later would suggest the violent fantasies had begun in early adolescence. Born in 1948 in a small village outside Poznan, Dariusz grew up in the shadow of post-war Poland, a landscape still scarred by occupation, poverty, and collective trauma. His father, a factory worker with a violent temper amplified by alcohol, beat his wife and children with regularity. His mother, broken by years of abuse, retreated into religious fanaticism, seeing demons in everyday occurrences and subjecting young Dariush to hours of forced prayer meant to cleanse the evil she claimed to see in his eyes. Neighbors would later recall that Dariush was a quiet child, unusually so. He never cried when other children bullied him. He never laughed during games. Teachers described him as intelligent but distant, as though he existed behind an invisible barrier that separated him from normal human connection. At age 12, local cats began disappearing from the neighborhood. Some were found days later, their bodies displayed in ways that suggested experimentation rather than simple cruelty. No one connected the incidents to the silent boy who always seemed to be watching from windows and doorways. By his early 20s, Katwika had developed the persona that would serve him throughout his killing career. The helpful stranger, the polite neighbor, the man you wouldn't look at twice. He worked various jobs: construction laborer, delivery driver, warehouse worker. Nothing that required much interaction, but everything that provided mobility and access. He was punctual, rarely complained, and could disappear into any crowd. Coworkers described him as forgettable. That anonymity was his greatest weapon. After Zofia's murder, the investigation stalled almost immediately. Poland in 1975 was a country struggling with political repression, economic hardship, and a police force ill-equipped to handle complex homicide investigations. The murder was shocking, yes, but it was also an isolated incident in a large city dealing with numerous violent crimes. The case went cold within months, filed away in a drawer with other unsolved murders, a drawer that would grow significantly heavier in the years to come. Katwika waited 14 months before killing again. This cooling-off period would later suggest to criminal psychologists that he possessed unusual self-control for a serial offender, the ability to resist impulses that most violent predators cannot. But resist is not the same as suppress. During those 14 months, he was refining his technique, studying his mistakes, preparing for what would come next. The second victim was Anna Mazur, a 19-year-old university student who vanished while walking home from an evening class in December 1976. Her body was discovered 3 weeks later in an abandoned building scheduled for demolition. The decomposition made certain forensic details difficult to ascertain, but enough remained to horrify investigators. Like Zofia, Anna had been bound with wire. Like Zofia, she had been stabbed repeatedly in a pattern that suggested deliberation rather than rage. And like Zofia, her eyes had been removed and placed in her palms. This time, detectives recognized they were dealing with something beyond a random act of violence. The signature was too specific, too unusual to be coincidental. A task force was assembled, but resources remained limited. The Iron Curtain still separated Eastern Europe from the West, and information sharing between police agencies was complicated by political barriers and mutual suspicion. What Polish investigators didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that their killer was preparing to expand his hunting ground far beyond their borders. In 1978, Katwika obtained documentation that allowed him to travel throughout Eastern Europe for work-related purposes. The exact nature of this documentation remains murky, lost in the bureaucratic chaos of communist-era record-keeping, but its implications were devastating. He could now move freely between Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, and Romania. He could kill in one country and return home before the body was even discovered. And that is precisely what he did. The murders accelerated. Between 1978 and 1982, 16 bodies were discovered across 5 countries, all women between the ages of 18 and 35, all killed with the same methodical brutality, all marked with the same horrifying signature. The victims were students, waitresses, nurses, shop clerks, women whose disappearances were noted, but whose cases rarely received extensive investigation. They were often alone when taken, snatched from streets, bus stops, train stations. Some vanished in broad daylight, simply there one moment and gone the next, as though the earth had opened and swallowed them whole. What Katwika did to these women defies comfortable description, but to understand the true nature of his pathology, the details cannot be sanitized. Each victim was held for a period ranging from several hours to 3 days. During this time, he would subject them to escalating torture. He used knives, pliers, electrical cables. He would burn them with cigarettes, methodically covering their bodies with circular scars. He would break their fingers one by one, taking breaks between each fracture to let the pain intensify before continuing. The stabbing always came last, always in the same pattern, starting with the extremities and working inward, avoiding major arteries until he decided it was time to end it. Investigators across multiple countries were slowly beginning to recognize patterns, but the political landscape made coordination nearly impossible. A murder in Warsaw had no official connection to a murder in Prague, even when the signatures were identical. Each country's police force worked in isolation, protecting their jurisdictions and information, unwilling to admit that a killer was operating across their borders with impunity. Kotwicka understood this fragmentation. He exploited it brilliantly. He would kill in one country, then vanish for months, resurfacing in another location entirely. He varied his victim selection enough to prevent easy pattern recognition. Blondes, brunettes, tall, short, different occupations, different social classes. The only constant was his method and his signature. And that signature, the removal of the eyes, the placement in the palms, became the key that would eventually unlock the full scope of his crimes. But that revelation was still years away. For now, in the early 1980s, Dariusz Kotwicka remained invisible, a phantom moving through Europe, leaving death in his wake like some obscene calling card. He had perfected his predatory instincts, refined his ability to identify and isolate vulnerable targets, mastered the art of vanishing after each kill. He was comfortable in his monstrosity, confident in his invincibility, and he was nowhere near finished. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 changed everything, not just for Europe but for Dariusz Kotwicka. The dissolution of communist regimes and the opening of borders provided him with unprecedented freedom of movement. Where once he was restricted to Eastern Europe, now the entire continent became his hunting ground. And he seized this opportunity with a predator's enthusiasm, escalating both the frequency and brutality of his attacks. The first Western European victim attributed to Kotwicka was discovered in April 1990, though investigators wouldn't make the connection for another 2 years. Martine Dubois, a 24-year-old au pair from Lyon, France, had been visiting friends in Munich when she disappeared. Her body was found in a storage unit rented under a false name, discovered only when the owner noticed a terrible smell emanating from the space. By the time police arrived, Martine had been dead for approximately 2 weeks. The condition of her body shocked even experienced German homicide detectives. She had been subjected to the same methodical torture that characterized Kotwicka's earlier victims, but there was an escalation that suggested his pathology was deepening. In addition to the stab wounds and the trademark eye removal, her skin bore evidence of prolonged abuse, burns, lacerations, bruising that indicated sustained beatings. The medical examiner estimated she had been held captive for at least 48 hours, possibly longer. Every moment of those hours had been filled with unimaginable suffering. What German investigators couldn't have known was that this was part of an evolving pattern. Kotwicka was no longer satisfied with the quick abductions and murders that had characterized his earlier work. He wanted more time with his victims. He was developing rituals, elaborate scenarios that played out over days rather than hours. He had graduated from serial killer to something worse, a torturer who derived satisfaction not just from the act of killing but from the prolonged infliction of pain. Between 1990 and 1992, bodies began appearing across Western Europe with disturbing regularity. Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria, Denmark, each country reported murders that bore similar characteristics, but without a centralized database or international task force, the connections remained undrawn. Each police force worked their cases independently, unaware that they were chasing the same phantom. In Amsterdam, sex worker Saskia van der Berg was found in a canal, her body wrapped in plastic sheeting. The removal of her eyes and the pattern of stab wounds matched Kotwicka's signature perfectly, but Dutch police initially classified it as a client-related murder, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence in that particular line of work. They were wrong, catastrophically so. Kotwicka had simply adapted his victim selection to include women whose disappearances might attract less attention, whose murders might be written off as occupational hazards. When Ingrid's body was found in an abandoned warehouse 6 weeks later, the sisters' instincts were tragically validated. The Danish detectives assigned to the case noticed something peculiar in the evidence photographs. The stab wound pattern, while horrible, had a geometric precision that seemed familiar to the lead investigator, a detective named Lars Hansen who had a reputation for his encyclopedic memory of unsolved cases. Hansen began pulling files from other Scandinavian countries, then expanding his search to the rest of Europe. He worked nights and weekends, driven by a growing certainty that what they were seeing wasn't isolated incidents, but a connected series of murders spanning years and multiple countries. What Hansen discovered was chilling. He found 23 unsolved murders across 11 countries, all bearing remarkably similar characteristics. The victims were all women, all found with multiple stab wounds in geometric patterns, and, in the cases where decomposition hadn't destroyed the evidence, all missing their eyes. Hansen prepared a comprehensive report and submitted it to Interpol, arguing for the establishment of an international task force to hunt what he believed was Europe's most prolific serial killer operating in modern times. The bureaucratic wheels of international law enforcement turned slowly, but Hansen's report was too compelling to ignore. In January 1992, an unprecedented joint task force was assembled, bringing together investigators from 12 countries. They codenamed their target Cross-Border Unknown Subject 1, or CBUS-1. They had no idea who they were hunting, but they finally understood the scope of what they were dealing with. The task force began the painstaking work of compiling evidence from multiple jurisdictions, looking for connections that had been invisible when each country worked in isolation. They created a timeline of murders, plotted them on maps, analyzed victim selection patterns, studied the evolution of the killer's methods. A profile began to emerge. A male, likely in his 40s, physically unremarkable, capable of blending into any environment. Someone with access to transportation and the freedom to cross borders regularly. Someone organized, patient, and utterly devoid of empathy. What they needed was a break, a piece of evidence that would give them a name. That break came from an unexpected source, a traffic camera in the town of Salzburg, Austria. In March 1992, a woman named Barbara Wimmer was reported missing. The last confirmed sighting placed her at a bus stop near the city center at approximately 7:15 p.m. Investigators reviewed footage from nearby traffic cameras, looking for any sign of Barbara or suspicious vehicles in the area. On one camera, they found something interesting. A van, dark-colored and nondescript, had pulled up near the bus stop at 7:13 p.m. The footage was grainy, shot from a distance, but investigators could see a man exit the driver's side and approach the bus stop. The timestamp showed him speaking with someone, presumably Barbara, for approximately 45 seconds before both individuals walked to the van and departed together. The entire interaction appeared casual, unthreatening. No struggle, no obvious coercion. She had gone willingly. The license plate was partially visible in 2 frames. Forensic video specialists enhanced the image, running the partial plate through every database available. They got a hit: a van registered to a Polish national named Dariusz Kotwicka, employed by an international transport company that contracted deliveries throughout Europe. The investigators cross-referenced his employment records with their murder timeline. The correlation was damning. Kotwicka had been present in or near every city where a murder had occurred, on or around the dates when the victims had disappeared. Barbara Wimmer's body was discovered in May 1992, hidden in a culvert outside Salzburg. The autopsy revealed the now familiar pattern of torture and mutilation. But this time, investigators had more than just a body. They had a suspect, they had a name, and they had the beginning of a case that would expose one of the most horrific killing sprees in European criminal history. The hunt for Dariusz Kotwicka began in earnest. Arrest warrants were issued in multiple countries. His photograph, a driver's license photo showing a thin-faced man with receding dark hair, unremarkable features, and eyes that revealed nothing, was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the continent. The man who had operated in shadows for 17 years was finally exposed to light. But exposing him and capturing him were 2 very different challenges. Kotwicka had vanished. His apartment in Wrocław was abandoned, cleared of personal belongings. His employer reported that he hadn't shown up for work in over a month. Family members, distant relatives who barely knew him, said they hadn't heard from him in years. It was as though he had anticipated the investigation, recognized the walls closing in, and disappeared before the trap could spring. The manhunt expanded, becoming one of the most intensive searches in European law enforcement history. Meanwhile, investigators continued excavating Kotwicka's past, building a comprehensive understanding of the man they were hunting. What they discovered was a portrait of someone who had been preparing for a life of violence from an early age. Interviews with childhood acquaintances revealed a pattern of animal cruelty, social isolation, and barely concealed rage. Former co-workers described a man who was pleasant enough on the surface but who never formed genuine friendships, never revealed anything personal, never seemed fully present in conversations. He was always watching, always observing, always separate from the normal flow of human interaction. Psychiatric experts brought in to consult on the case suggested that Kotwicka exhibited characteristics of extreme antisocial personality disorder combined with sadistic tendencies that went far beyond typical psychopathy. He didn't kill out of rage or sexual gratification, though sexual assault was a component of many attacks, but rather from a desire to exert absolute control, to reduce his victims to objects that existed solely for his entertainment. The torture wasn't a means to an end. The torture was the point. The task force also made a disturbing discovery about victim count. The 23 murders they had connected to Kotwicka represented only the cases where bodies had been found and preserved well enough for signature identification. Investigators now believed there were likely dozens more victims whose bodies had never been discovered, or whose remains had been too decomposed to reveal the telltale signs of Kotwicka's work. The true number of his victims might never be known. As summer turned to fall in 1992, the manhunt continued without success. Kotwicka had gone to ground somewhere, possibly hiding in a remote area, possibly having fled Europe entirely. Some investigators theorized he might have committed suicide, unable to bear the exposure of his secret life. Others believed he was simply waiting, biding his time until attention waned and he could resume his activities elsewhere. The truth, as it turned out, was far simpler and more mundane than anyone had guessed. While investigators searched for Dariusz Kotwicka across Europe, he was hiding less than 50 kilometers from his hometown, in a small hunting cabin owned by a deceased uncle. The property, inherited by Kotwicka's estranged cousin who lived in Germany and never visited, was isolated and forgotten, situated deep in a forested area that saw few visitors even during hunting season. It was perfect for his purposes, and those purposes included continuing his work. On the evening of September 18, 1992, 21-year-old Eva Wojcik was returning home from her job at a grocery store in a small town outside Wrocław. The route between the store and her apartment was less than 2 kilometers, a walk she had made hundreds of times without incident. On this particular evening, a man in a delivery van pulled alongside her and asked for directions to a nearby address. Eva, helpful by nature, approached the passenger window to better hear the man's question. It was the last decision she would ever make. Kotwicka's method of abduction had been perfected over nearly 2 decades of practice. The moment Eva leaned toward the window, he deployed a chemical-soaked cloth to her face, rendering her unconscious in seconds. He pulled her into the van before anyone could witness the attack, and drove away without rushing, without drawing attention, without leaving any evidence at the scene. To anyone who might have glanced their way, it looked like nothing more than someone giving a friend a ride. By the time Ava's family reported her missing 8 hours later, she was already imprisoned in the cabin, and her nightmare had begun. The task force investigating Kotwicka's crimes would later determine, through forensic evidence and Kotwicka's own testimony, that he held Ava captive for 5 days. During that time, he subjected her to the most severe torture documented in any of his cases. He had by now refined his techniques to maximize both physical pain and psychological terror. He would alternate between violence and calm conversation, between torture sessions and moments where he would feed her and clean her wounds, creating a disorienting cycle that destroyed any sense of what might come next. The physical abuse was systematic and escalating. He began with superficial cuts, then progressed to deeper lacerations. He used pliers to break her fingers and toes individually, waiting for her screams to subside between each fracture. He employed cigarettes and a portable torch to burn patterns into her skin, creating the geometric designs that had become his signature. And he talked throughout, calmly explaining what he was going to do next, asking her questions about her pain, documenting her responses in a notebook that investigators would later find among his possessions. On the 5th day, Kotwicka began the final phase of his ritual. The stabbing was, as always, methodical and prolonged. He started with her extremities, making shallow punctures that bled but didn't kill. He worked his way inward, covering her body with wounds that formed his characteristic geometric pattern. Only after she had endured this for more than an hour did he finally cut her throat, ending her suffering. After death, he removed her eyes with surgical tools he had stolen years earlier, placing them in her palms in the ritual that defined his crimes. Then he wrapped her body in plastic sheeting and buried it in a shallow grave behind the cabin. Ava was not Kotwicka's last victim, but she was his most thoroughly documented. The notebook found later provided horrifying insight into his thought processes, his complete lack of remorse, his clinical approach to causing maximum suffering. Mental health professionals who reviewed the document described it as one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence they had encountered in their careers. A roadmap of pure sadism written in calm, precise language that made the content even more chilling. 3 weeks after Ava's murder, Kotwicka abducted his final victim. Her name was Magdalena Gorska, a 26-year-old teacher from Poznan who had been visiting friends in a village near where Kotwicka was hiding. The abduction followed his established pattern: a request for help, a moment of vulnerability, chemical-induced unconsciousness, and disappearance. But this time, something went wrong. Magdalena's friends had been walking approximately 50 meters behind her when she stopped to talk to the man in the van. They couldn't hear the conversation, but they noticed their friend leaning toward the vehicle, then saw her body go limp as the man pulled her inside. It happened so quickly that they initially thought they had misunderstood what they were seeing. But as the van pulled away, urgency overcame confusion. They ran to a nearby house and called the police, providing a description of the vehicle and a partial license plate number. The license plate, cross-referenced against the task force's database, came back as a match for the van Kotwicka had abandoned months earlier. But more importantly, the location of the abduction allowed investigators to narrow their search radius. If Kotwicka was operating in this area, he had to have a base nearby, somewhere remote enough to avoid detection but close enough to access his hunting grounds. The task force mobilized every available resource, flooding the region with officers, conducting door-to-door searches, interviewing locals about unfamiliar residents or suspicious activity. A break came from an unexpected source: a forest ranger who reported seeing smoke from a chimney in an area where no occupied structures should exist. The ranger knew the cabin in question was officially abandoned, inherited by an owner who lived abroad and never visited. Smoke meant someone was there, someone who wanted to stay hidden. A tactical team surrounded the cabin on the evening of October 14, 1992. They approached in darkness, using night vision equipment to survey the structure before making entry. Through a window, they observed a single occupant inside, a man matching Kotwicka's description, sitting at a table and writing in a notebook. They observed for nearly an hour, looking for any sign that Magdalena Gorska might be inside, hoping they weren't too late. At 11:47 p.m., the team made their move. They breached the door simultaneously with the windows, flooding the cabin with armed officers shouting commands in Polish and German. Kotwicka stood from his chair, raised his hands, and smiled. That smile would feature prominently in the nightmares of several officers present. Not a smile of surrender or relief, but something else entirely. Something satisfied, something complete. Magdalena Gorska was found in the cabin's cellar, chained to a support beam in near-total darkness. She had been held captive for 19 days, subjected to torture that left her barely conscious and on the verge of death from infection and blood loss. Paramedics worked frantically to stabilize her for transport, unsure if she would survive the journey to the hospital. Against all odds, she did survive, though the physical and psychological scars would last a lifetime. The The cabin was a horror show that exceeded even the task force's grimmest expectations. The walls were covered with photographs of victims, some identified from previous investigations, others unknown, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and pain. Tools of torture were arranged neatly on shelves, knives of various sizes, pliers, wire, syringes, chemicals. A filing cabinet contained journals dating back to 1975, each entry describing a murder in clinical detail, including dates, locations, victim descriptions, and techniques employed. Kotwicka had documented everything, creating an archive of atrocity that would take investigators months to fully process. Most disturbing were the 23 glass jars found in a locked cabinet, each containing a pair of human eyes preserved in formaldehyde. Kotwicka had kept trophies from his victims, displaying them in his private gallery of death. DNA testing would eventually identify 19 of the victims, connecting murders across 12 countries spanning 17 years. The remaining 4 sets of eyes would never be matched to known victims, representing women whose disappearances had gone unreported or whose cases remained in the cold case files of police departments that never knew to look for a connection. During his interrogation, Kotwicka displayed the same calm demeanor that had characterized his entire adult life. He answered questions matter-of-factly, neither boastful nor apologetic. When asked why he killed, he responded simply, "Because I wanted to." When pressed about whether he felt remorse, he seemed genuinely puzzled by the question, as though the interviewer had asked if he regretted eating breakfast that morning. The concept of remorse, of empathy, of recognizing his victims as human beings rather than objects, these were completely foreign to him. Forensic psychiatrists who evaluated Kotwicka diagnosed him with severe antisocial personality disorder, sadistic personality disorder, and psychopathy so extreme that he represented one of the most dangerous individuals they had ever assessed. They concluded that he was fully aware his actions were illegal but incapable of understanding why they were morally wrong. He possessed the intellectual knowledge that society condemned murder, but lacked any emotional or ethical framework that would prevent him from killing. He was, in the truest sense of the term, a predator who viewed other humans as prey. The investigation into Kotwicka's crimes continued for 2 years after his arrest, as task force members worked to identify victims, notify families, and build comprehensive cases for prosecution. The final count of confirmed victims was 43 women murdered across 13 countries between 1975 and 1992. The actual number was likely higher, possibly significantly so, but without bodies or sufficient evidence, those deaths would remain statistical probabilities rather than confirmed facts. The families of identified victims faced the agonizing process of learning what had happened to their daughters, sisters, wives, and mothers. Some had spent years hoping for a different outcome, clinging to the possibility that their loved ones had simply disappeared voluntarily and might someday return. The truth, when it came, was devastating. But for many, even terrible knowledge was preferable to eternal uncertainty. At least now they knew. At least now they could grieve properly, could bury their dead, in cases where bodies had been recovered, could begin the impossible process of moving forward. For Magdalena Gorska, survival came with burdens that sometimes made her wish the outcome had been different. She endured dozens of surgeries to repair the damage Kotwicka had inflicted, spent years in therapy addressing the psychological trauma, and lived with constant reminders of her ordeal in the form of scars that covered her body. She would later say that the worst part wasn't the physical pain or even the memories of the torture itself, but the knowledge that she had been completely powerless, that her life had been in the hands of someone who viewed her suffering as entertainment. That loss of agency, of control, of basic human dignity, those wounds proved harder to heal than any physical injury. The trial of Dariusz Kotwicka began on March 15, 1994, in Wrocław, Poland, where he had committed his first confirmed murder nearly 2 decades earlier. Due to the international nature of his crimes and the unprecedented cooperation between multiple countries in building the case, the proceedings were designated as a special international tribunal, with representatives from 13 nations participating in the prosecution. It was one of the most complex and high-profile criminal trials in European history. Security at the courthouse was unprecedented. Death threats against Kotwicka had been pouring in since his arrest, including credible plots by family members of victims who wanted to take justice into their own hands. The courthouse was surrounded by barriers, armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and every person entering the building underwent rigorous screening. Inside the courtroom, Kotwicka sat in a reinforced glass booth, separated from the gallery by bulletproof barriers. He appeared calm, almost bored, as though attending a business meeting rather than his own trial for mass murder. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented forensic evidence linking Kotwicka to 43 murders, including DNA matches, fiber evidence, tool mark analysis, and victim identification confirmed through dental records and personal effects found in the cabin. They introduced the journals, the photographs, the preserved eyes. Evidence so disturbing that multiple jurors required medical attention during presentations, overwhelmed by the graphic nature of what they were seeing. They brought forth survivors, including Magdalena Gorska, whose testimony about her 19 days of captivity brought the courtroom to stunned silence. Magdalena's appearance on the stand was one of the trial's most powerful moments. She entered the courtroom wearing long sleeves and gloves despite the warm spring weather, concealing the scars that covered her arms. Her voice was steady as she described her abduction, her imprisonment, the systematic torture she endured. She didn't look at Kotwicka during her testimony, focusing instead on the prosecution attorney who gently guided her through the nightmare of her memories. When asked if she could identify her attacker, she finally turned to face the glass booth. Their eyes met for 5 seconds that felt eternal. She nodded once, said, "Yes, that is him," and then asked to be excused. She never returned to the courtroom. The defense strategy was as remarkable as it was futile. Kotwicka's attorneys didn't dispute the facts of the murders or attempt to claim their client's innocence. Instead, they argued that he was legally insane, incapable of distinguishing right from wrong, and therefore not criminally responsible for his actions. They presented psychiatric experts who testified about his severe personality disorders, his complete lack of empathy, his inability to process moral concepts the way normal humans did. They argued that executing or imprisoning someone who was fundamentally unable to control or understand their actions was unjust. The prosecution countered with their own psychiatric experts who agreed that Kotwicka had severe mental disorders but argued that these didn't meet the legal threshold for insanity. He knew his actions were illegal. He took extensive precautions to avoid capture, demonstrating awareness that society condemned his behavior. He planned his murders carefully, showing clear intent and premeditation. The fact that he didn't feel guilty about killing didn't mean he didn't understand that killing was wrong. It simply meant he didn't care. Legal insanity required an inability to understand the nature of one's actions. Kotwicka understood perfectly. He simply lacked the moral framework that would have stopped him. Perhaps the most chilling moment of the trial came when Kotwicka himself took the stand. Against his attorney's advice, he insisted on testifying, claiming he wanted to clarify certain misunderstandings about his work. He spoke for 4 hours over 2 days, describing his murders in the same clinical, detached tone he had used in his journals. He corrected prosecutors on details they had gotten wrong: the number of stab wounds in a particular victim, the exact location where a body had been found, the sequence of torture techniques he had employed. He showed no emotion, no remorse, no awareness that his words were horrifying everyone present. When the prosecution asked why he had killed 43 women, Kotwicka paused for a long moment, seeming to genuinely consider the question. His response would be quoted in criminology textbooks for decades to come. "I did it because I could, because they were there, and I was curious what would happen if I made them hurt. That's all. There's no deeper meaning you're looking for. I enjoyed it, so I continued doing it. If you're asking me to explain why I enjoyed it, I can't. Do you understand why you enjoy music? Or good food? Or sunshine? You just do. This was the same for me." The trial lasted 11 weeks. During that time, investigators from multiple countries presented evidence. Victims' families gave impact statements. Experts testified about Kotwicka's psychology. And the defense mounted what they knew was a doomed effort to spare their client from the maximum possible punishment. When testimony finally concluded, the court adjourned for deliberation. The verdict came back in less than 6 hours. Guilty on 43 counts of first-degree murder. Guilty on 43 counts of kidnapping. Guilty on numerous counts of torture, sexual assault, and unlawful imprisonment. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Christina Nowak who had presided over the trial with remarkable composure, read the verdict without emotion, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was announcing. When she reached the sentencing phase, she paused, made eye contact with Kotwicka through the glass barrier, and delivered a statement that would be remembered as one of the most powerful judicial pronouncements in modern European legal history. Dariusz Kotwicka, you have been found guilty of crimes that challenge our fundamental understanding of human nature. You have taken 43 lives, 43 women who had futures, families, dreams, and aspirations. You reduced them to objects of your sadistic curiosity, subjected them to torments that defy adequate description, and showed not one moment of remorse or recognition of their humanity. This court has heard psychiatric experts debate whether you are capable of moral reasoning. That debate, while academically interesting, is ultimately irrelevant to the question before me. You knew what you were doing. You knew society forbade it. You did it anyway, repeatedly, methodically, for 17 years. The law is clear on how such actions must be answered. She sentenced him to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, to be served in solitary confinement due to the danger he posed to other inmates and the likelihood that other prisoners would attempt to kill him. Poland had abolished the death penalty in 1988, removing that option from consideration. Some victims' families expressed frustration at this limitation, believing that Kotwicka deserved execution for his crimes. Others felt that a lifetime in isolation represented a more appropriate punishment, a slow, grinding existence devoid of the freedom and excitement he had stolen from his victims. The International Tribunal also issued secondary sentences for crimes committed in other jurisdictions, ensuring that even if Polish law somehow changed or his sentence was commuted, he would remain imprisoned under German, Austrian, French, and Danish law. There would be no legal mechanism for his release. He would die in prison, alone and forgotten, his name eventually fading from public consciousness, even as his crimes remained in the textbooks and case files of law enforcement agencies worldwide. Kotwicka was transported to a maximum security facility outside Warsaw, where he was placed in a single cell measuring 3 meters by 4 meters. He would spend 23 hours each day in this space, allowed 1 hour in a private exercise yard under constant supervision. He had no contact with other prisoners, limited interaction with guards, no access to television or internet. He could read books and write letters, though all correspondence was screened and subject to approval. For a man who had spent 17 years roaming freely across Europe, hunting at will, the restriction must have been suffocating. If it bothered him, he never showed it. In the months following the trial, investigative journalists and criminologists sought interviews with Kotwicka, hoping to gain insight into the mind of someone capable of such sustained cruelty. He declined most requests but agreed to speak with Dr. Heinrich Vogel, a German criminal psychologist who had studied serial killers for 3 decades. Their conversations, conducted over 6 months and later published in heavily redacted form, provided a window into Kotwicka's psychology that was both illuminating and deeply disturbing. Dr. Vogel noted that Kotwicka displayed characteristics typically associated with extreme psychopathy: superficial charm when he chose to employ it, complete lack of empathy, no anxiety or fear about his situation, and an inability to form genuine emotional connections with other humans. But he also exhibited unusual traits that set him apart from other serial killers Vogel had studied. Unlike many violent offenders who developed elaborate rationalizations for their behavior, Kotwicka offered no justifications. He didn't claim his victims deserved what happened to them. He didn't construct some delusional framework where he was performing a service or teaching lessons. He simply acknowledged that he enjoyed causing pain and had acted on that enjoyment whenever circumstances allowed. When Dr. Vogel asked if Kotwicka ever thought about his victims as people, the answer was telling: "I thought about them as projects. Each one was a puzzle to solve. How much could they endure? What techniques produced the most interesting responses? How long I could keep them alive while maximizing their suffering? Their thoughts, their feelings, their lives before I took them. Those things weren't relevant to what I was doing. You don't think about a canvas's feelings when you paint on it. You don't wonder what the clay thinks when you sculpt it. They were material I worked with." This complete objectification of his victims represented perhaps the most chilling aspect of Kotwicka's psychology. He didn't kill out of rage or hatred. He didn't derive sexual satisfaction from the murders, though sexual assault was often a component. He simply viewed torture and murder as activities he enjoyed, no different from someone who enjoys gardening or building model trains. The moral dimension that prevents most humans from harming others was entirely absent from his psychological makeup. He was, in the truest sense, a monster who looked human. The impact of Katwika's crimes rippled far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The case prompted significant reforms in international law enforcement cooperation, leading to improved information sharing between countries and the establishment of databases designed to identify serial offenders operating across borders. The failures that had allowed Katwika to kill undetected for so long, the lack of coordination between police agencies, the absence of centralized databases, the tendency to treat each murder as an isolated incident, were addressed through new protocols and technologies that made it significantly harder for similar predators to operate with impunity. For the families of victims, the conclusion of the trial marked not an ending but a transition into a different kind of suffering. They had answers now, but answers brought their own pain. Knowing exactly what had happened to their loved ones, understanding the torture and terror of those final hours, living with the knowledge that somewhere in those 17 years their daughter or sister or mother had been screaming for help that never came. These were burdens that didn't ease with time. Some families found purpose in advocacy, working to improve victim support services, pushing for stronger laws protecting women from violence, speaking at conferences about the importance of international cooperation in fighting violent crime. Others retreated from public attention, processing their grief privately, trying to rebuild lives that had been shattered by Katwika's actions. There was no right way to cope with such loss, no roadmap for healing from trauma of this magnitude. Magdalena Gorska, the sole survivor of captivity, became an unintentional symbol of resilience. She never sought publicity and rarely spoke about her experience beyond her testimony at trial, but her survival itself represented hope, proof that even the darkest evil could be overcome, that life could continue even after experiencing the worst that humanity had to offer. She changed her name, moved to another country, and built a new life with the help of intensive therapy and support from a small circle of trusted friends. She married, had children, found ways to experience joy again despite the scars she carried. Her story, in its way, was as important as Katwika's, a reminder that victims were not defined solely by what had been done to them, that resilience was possible even in the face of unimaginable horror. Dariusz Katwika remained imprisoned for the next 15 years, his days blending into an endless monotonous loop of confinement. He never expressed remorse. He never claimed to have found religion or experienced some transformative realization about the wrongness of his actions. He simply existed, marking time, waiting for death. That death came on November 8, 2009, when Katwika was found unconscious in his cell, the victim of a massive stroke. He was transported to the prison hospital where he remained in a coma for 3 days before dying without regaining consciousness. He was 61 years old. The news of his death made headlines briefly, reminding a new generation of the horrors he had committed, but the coverage was minimal compared to the media frenzy during his trial. He died as he had lived most of his life, alone, disconnected from humanity, unmourned. His body was cremated without ceremony. No family members claimed his ashes, which were eventually scattered in an unmarked location by prison officials. There would be no grave to mark his existence, no monument to his life. His name would persist only in case files, criminology textbooks, and the memories of those whose lives he had destroyed. In death, as in life, he remained a cipher, a cautionary tale about the capacity for evil that can exist behind an unremarkable face. The final accounting of Katwika's victims took years to complete. Investigators continued working cold cases, using DNA technology that hadn't existed during his active years to identify remains and connect unsolved disappearances to his documented movements. By 2012, the confirmed victim count had risen to 57 women, with another 23 cases classified as probable but unconfirmable due to lack of physical evidence. The true number would never be known with certainty, lost to time, decomposition, and Katwika's strategic disposal methods. For investigators who had devoted years to hunting and prosecuting Katwika, his death brought complicated emotions. Relief that he could never harm anyone again. Frustration that he had escaped punishment by dying relatively peacefully rather than enduring decades more of imprisonment. Satisfaction that justice, however imperfect, had been served. Detective Lars Hansen, the Danish investigator whose research had first connected the cases and launched the international manhunt, retired 2 years after Kotwica's death. In his final interview before leaving the force, he reflected on the case that had defined his career. "We stopped him. That's what matters. 57 confirmed victims, probably more, but he didn't get to make it 60 or 70 or 100. We saved lives by catching him, even if we couldn't save the ones he'd already taken. That has to be enough because it's all we have. The families got answers. Magdalena survived. The monster died in a cage. It's not perfect justice. Perfect justice would be those women still alive, living the lives he stole from them. But it's the justice we could deliver, and I have to believe that means something." The legacy of Dariusz Kotwica's crimes extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of the murders themselves. His case became a watershed moment in European law enforcement, demonstrating both the vulnerabilities that allowed serial predators to operate across borders and the potential for international cooperation to address those vulnerabilities. The systems developed in response to his crimes have since been used to apprehend dozens of other serial offenders, preventing countless deaths and bringing closure to families who might otherwise have waited decades for answers. In academic circles, Kotwica became a subject of intense study. Criminologists, psychologists, and sociologists examined his case from every angle, trying to understand how someone could commit such atrocities without apparent internal conflict. His journals, his interviews, his behavior during trial, all were analyzed for insights into the nature of extreme psychopathy and the mechanisms that normally prevent humans from harming one another. The consensus that emerged was sobering. Some individuals are simply born without the neurological capacity for empathy, and when such individuals are also intelligent, organized, and motivated by sadistic impulses, they become predators against whom society must actively defend itself. The story of Dariusz Kotwica is not a mystery with a satisfying resolution. There are no lessons that make the horror worthwhile, no silver linings that redeem the suffering he caused. It is simply a documentation of evil in its purest form, methodical, remorseless, and sustained over nearly 2 decades. The only consolation, if it can be called that, is that he was eventually stopped. That he died in captivity rather than continuing his work. That his victims, at least some of them, were identified and their families given closure. That his methods, once exposed, led to improvements in how law enforcement combats international serial crime. The 43 women whose names were read at his sentencing, and the additional victims identified afterward, were more than statistics or case numbers. They were daughters, sisters, friends, students, workers, people with lives that mattered, with potential that was stolen, with families who loved them and grieved their loss. Their stories deserve to be remembered not just as cautionary tales about evil, but as tributes to the lives they could have lived if not for the actions of one unremarkable man who looked at human suffering and decided it was entertainment. Anna Kowalski, Magdalena Gorska, who survived, Eva Wojcik, Martine Dubois, all the others whose names filled page after page of court documents, each name representing a life taken, a family shattered, a future erased. They are the true story of the Euro Ripper case. Not the monster who killed them, but the people who deserved so much better than to become his victims. And in remembering them, in telling their stories alongside his, we perform the only act of resistance available against evil of this magnitude. We refuse to let them be forgotten. We insist that their lives mattered more than his crimes. We bear witness to both the darkness humans are capable of inflicting and the light that exists in remembering, honoring, and grieving those who were lost to that darkness. The case of Dariusz Kotwica closed officially with his death in 2009, but its echoes continue. Families still gather on anniversaries. Investigators still work cold cases connected to his movements. Survivors still process trauma that will never fully heal. And society remains vigilant, aware now in ways it wasn't before that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the ordinary man asking for directions, offering to help, seeming harmless right up until the moment they strike. The hunt is over. The monster is dead. But the scars remain, permanent reminders of what was lost and what must be protected. That is the final legacy of the Euro Ripper. Not just a catalog of horrors, but a stark reminder that evil exists, that vigilance is necessary, and that the price of complacency is measured in lives destroyed and futures stolen. The story ends not with redemption or meaning, but with the simple, heavy truth. It happened. 57 times it happened. And the only victory we can claim is that we ensured it didn't happen 58. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Lodger's Killer. Some doors close softly. Others slam with the weight of a body hitting the floor. They trusted him with their keys, their addresses, their most vulnerable hours. He walked through their homes like a ghost in the daylight, polite, unremarkable, forgettable. But Etienne Dedroug wasn't searching for shelter. He was hunting for silence. Between 1985 and 1987, elderly widows across Belgium opened their doors to a man whose eyes held nothing but winter. What followed wasn't just murder, it was erasure. Each victim welcomed him in as a lodger, a quiet tenant who paid on time and kept to himself. Each one died alone, their final moments swallowed by the very walls that were supposed to protect them. This is the story of the man who turned hospitality into a graveyard, who transformed trust into a weapon sharper than any blade. This is the story of the Lodger's Killer, a predator who didn't break into homes. He was invited in. The winter of 1985 crept into Belgium like an unwelcome confession. Cold, persistent, inescapable. Frost clung to window panes in the quiet residential neighborhoods of Antwerp and Brussels, where rows of narrow townhouses stood shoulder to shoulder, their brick facades weathered by decades of rain and snow. Inside these homes, elderly women lived out their final years in solitude, their husbands long dead, their children scattered across distant cities with families of their own. The houses were too large for one person, the silence too heavy. So they did what many lonely homeowners do. They placed advertisements in local newspapers, offering rooms for rent at modest prices. A little extra income, a little company, someone to hear their footsteps echo down the hallway in return. Etienne Dedroug read those advertisements with the focus of a man studying a map to buried treasure. Born in 1946, he was approaching 40 years old, with thinning brown hair, pale skin that rarely saw sunlight, and eyes that neighbors would later describe as empty. Not cruel, they would insist. Not wild or obviously dangerous, just empty, like looking into a room with all the furniture removed. He moved through life as a drifter, never holding employment for long, always wearing clothes that were clean but worn, speaking in soft tones that made him seem harmless, even pitiable. He had no permanent address, no close relationships, no ties to anyone or anything. He was a man made of smoke. There one moment, gone the next, leaving only the faintest trace of his presence behind. But smoke can suffocate. On a gray afternoon in late November 1985, an elderly widow named Maria Phillips answered a knock at her door. She lived in a modest home in the Deurne district of Antwerp, a neighborhood where people still greeted each other on the street and left their curtains open during the day. Maria was 73 years old, her husband dead for 6 years, her only daughter living in Germany with a family Maria had met only twice. The house felt cavernous without her husband's voice filling the rooms, so she had placed an advertisement offering a furnished room on the second floor. The rent was low, barely enough to cover heating costs, but that wasn't the point. She wanted someone there, someone to make tea for, someone whose footsteps she could hear moving above her while she watched television in the evenings. Etienne Dedroug stood on her doorstep wearing a tired smile and carrying a single battered suitcase. He told her his name, though it would later be discovered he used several aliases, and explained that he was looking for somewhere quiet to stay while he searched for work. His voice was gentle, almost apologetic, as though he were embarrassed to be asking for anything at all. Maria saw a man down on his luck, someone who needed help, and her instincts, honed by decades of motherhood and kindness, told her to let him in. She showed him the room upstairs, a small space with a single bed, a wooden dresser, and a window overlooking the street. He said it was perfect. She made him tea. They talked about the weather, about how difficult it was to find work these days, about nothing important. He seemed grateful. He seemed harmless. He moved in that evening. For the first few days, Etienne was the model tenant. He kept to himself, paid his first week's rent in cash, and made no noise. Maria would hear him moving around upstairs in the early mornings. Soft footsteps, the creak of the bed frame, the muffled sound of water running in the shared bathroom. He greeted her politely when their paths crossed in the hallway, always offering a small nod, sometimes commenting on the cold weather or asking if she needed anything from the shops. She began to relax around him. He was no trouble at all. In fact, she barely noticed he was there. That was exactly what he wanted. On the night of December 3rd, Maria Phillips went to bed at her usual time, 10:30, after watching the evening news and locking the front door. She took her medication, turned off the lights, and settled into the routine that had carried her through 6 years of widowhood. Upstairs, Etienne Dedrug sat on the edge of his rented bed, waiting. He had learned her patterns over the past week, cataloging every detail the way a surgeon memorizes anatomy before making the first incision. He knew she was a light sleeper. He knew the floorboards in the hallway creaked near the bathroom. He knew she kept her handbag on the kitchen counter, her small amount of cash tucked inside a worn leather wallet. He knew she would be defenseless. Just after midnight, he stood up. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway, a sound that seemed to grow louder in the darkness, marking time like a countdown. Etienne moved with the practiced calm of someone who had done this before, though investigators would later struggle to confirm whether Maria Phillips was truly his first victim or simply the first one discovered. He descended the stairs slowly, avoiding the creaking steps, his breathing steady and controlled. The door to Maria's bedroom was closed but not locked. Why would it be? She lived alone, or so she thought. He turned the handle and stepped inside. What happened in that room over the next several minutes was an act of such calculated brutality that even hardened detectives would later struggle to describe it without their voices faltering. Maria woke to find a shadow standing over her bed, a figure that should not have been there, a presence that shattered the sanctuary of her own home in an instant. She tried to scream, but his hands were already moving, already closing around her throat with mechanical precision. There was no rage in his actions, no frenzy or loss of control. He strangled her with the detached efficiency of someone performing a routine task, his face expressionless in the darkness, his breathing unchanged. Maria thrashed beneath him, her frail hands clawing at his wrists, her legs kicking uselessly against the mattress. But she was 73 years old, weakened by age and shock, and he was a man in his prime who had come prepared to kill. It took nearly 4 minutes for her to die. Afterward, Etienne stood over her body, his pulse barely elevated, and studied his work the way a painter might step back from a canvas. Maria's eyes were open, frozen in an expression of terror and disbelief. The last thing she had seen was the face of the man she had welcomed into her home, the man she had made tea for, the man she had trusted. He closed her eyelids with 2 fingers, not out of respect, but because open eyes unsettled him. Then he went through her belongings methodically, taking the small amount of cash from her handbag, a piece of jewelry from her dresser, and a few other items of negligible value. Money was not the primary motive, it never would be, but he took it anyway, perhaps as an afterthought, perhaps to make the crime appear to be a burglary gone wrong. Before leaving, he wiped down the surfaces he had touched, returned to his rented room, and packed his suitcase. By 3 in the morning, he was gone, the front door locked behind him, Maria's body growing cold in her bed. It would be 2 days before her daughter in Germany, unable to reach her mother by phone, called a neighbor to check on her. The neighbor found Maria lying in bed as though she were sleeping, except for the bruises around her neck and the stillness that no sleep could mimic. The police investigation began immediately, but the trail was already cold. The man who had rented the room had given a false name. He had paid in cash. He had left no fingerprints. Neighbors could describe him only in the vaguest terms. Average height, thin build, brown hair, quiet. He was a ghost. And ghosts, as the people of Belgium were about to learn, can move from house to house without ever being seen. While detectives in Antwerp interviewed neighbors and searched for leads that didn't exist, Etienne Dedroug was already scanning newspapers in a different city. His eyes moving down columns of classified advertisements, searching for his next landlady, his next victim, his next locked door to open from the inside. The pattern had been established. The method had been tested. And the man who wore a tenant's smile was just getting started. The winter deepened. The cold pressed harder against windows and doors. And in homes across Belgium, elderly women continued to place advertisements for lodgers, never imagining that the knock they were waiting for might be the last sound they would ever invite into their lives. Maria Phillips was dead, but her death was only the beginning. Spring arrived in Belgium with reluctant warmth, melting the last remnants of snow from the streets and coaxing crocuses through the thawing ground. But for the families of elderly women living alone, the season brought no comfort, no renewal. Instead, it brought a growing list of names, women who had opened their doors to a stranger and never lived to regret it. By the time investigators began to see the pattern connecting these deaths, Etienne Dedroug had already moved through multiple cities, multiple identities, multiple homes where the welcome mat became a funeral shroud. His second confirmed victim was discovered in April 1986. Her name was Jean Goossens, an 81-year-old widow living in the Brussels suburb of Ucla. Like Maria Phillips, Jean had advertised a room for rent in the local newspaper, a small upstairs bedroom with shared access to the bathroom and kitchen. Like Maria, she was lonely, her husband dead for nearly a decade, her children grown and distant, visiting only on holidays if the weather permitted and work schedules allowed. The house was too quiet without another presence, too filled with the ghosts of conversations that no longer happened. So when a polite, soft-spoken man in his late 30s appeared at her door with a suitcase and a sad story about hard times, she saw an opportunity for companionship, however modest. She saw someone who needed help. She never saw the predator studying her vulnerabilities like a contractor assessing a building's weak points. Etienne moved into Jean's home on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying the same worn suitcase he had carried to Maria Phillips's door months earlier. He paid 2 weeks' rent in advance, cash, always cash, and thanked Jean with a humility that seemed almost excessive. She showed him the house rules, the shared spaces, the cupboard where he could keep his food separate from hers. He nodded agreeably to everything, his expression open and grateful, his voice never rising above a conversational murmur. That first evening, they sat together in the living room while Jean watched a game show on television. He asked polite questions about her life, about her late husband, her children, her youth during the war years. She answered with the eagerness of someone who had not been asked about herself in a very long time. She liked him. He seemed interested. He seemed kind. He was neither. For 11 days, Etienne played the role of the perfect lodger. He kept his room immaculate. He washed his dishes immediately after using them. He offered to carry Jean's groceries when he saw her returning from the market. He complimented her cooking when she invited him to join her for dinner, though he rarely ate much, picking at his food with the disinterest of someone whose mind was occupied elsewhere. Jean told a neighbor that she was pleased with her new tenant, that it was nice to have someone in the house again, that he was no trouble at all. The neighbor, an older woman who lived 3 doors down, smiled and said how wonderful that must be. Neither of them could have known they were discussing a man who had already killed once and was preparing to kill again. On the 12th night, Jean Goossens went to bed at her usual time. She took her blood pressure medication with a glass of water, changed into her nightgown, and turned off the lamp on her bedside table. The house settled into the particular silence of an old building at night, the creak of cooling wood, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the barely audible sound of wind moving through the eaves. Upstairs, Etienne Dedroug lay on his rented bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the house to fall completely silent. He had learned Jean's routine just as he had learned Maria's. He knew she sometimes woke during the night to use the bathroom. He knew she kept a glass of water on her nightstand. He knew the layout of her bedroom, the placement of her furniture, the exact distance from her bed to the door. At 1:15 in the morning, he rose and descended the stairs. Jean's bedroom door was closed, but like Maria's, it was not locked. Etienne opened it slowly, inch by inch, the hinges whispering but not crying out. The room was dark except for the faint glow of a streetlight filtering through thin curtains. He could see Jean's shape beneath the blankets, the rise and fall of her breathing, the vulnerability of sleep. He crossed the room in 4 steps. His shadow fell across her face, and then his hands were on her throat. Jean's eyes flew open in an instant of pure, primal terror, the terror of prey that suddenly understands it has been caught. She tried to scream, but his grip was already constricting her windpipe, cutting off air and sound with equal efficiency. Her hands flew to his wrists, her fingers clawing desperately, her nails breaking against his skin. But Etienne's expression never changed. His breathing remained steady. His grip never faltered. He strangled her with the same methodical precision he had used on Maria Phillips, applying pressure with both thumbs against her larynx, leaning his weight forward to pin her against the mattress. Jean's legs kicked violently, her heels drumming against the bed frame in a rhythm that sounded almost like knocking, as though she were trying to alert someone, anyone, to what was happening. But there was no one to hear. The neighbor 3 doors down was asleep. The street was empty. The world continued outside Jean's window, utterly indifferent to her dying. Took longer this time, nearly 6 minutes. Jean was older than Maria, frilier, but she fought with the desperate strength of someone who refuses to accept that death has entered her bedroom. Etienne had to adjust his grip twice as she twisted beneath him, her survival instinct refusing to surrender even as her body weakened. But eventually, inevitably, her movements slowed. Her hands fell away from his wrists. Her eyes, which had been locked on his face in horrified recognition, began to glaze over. And then she was still. Etienne released her and stepped back, breathing slightly harder now. Not from exertion, but from the adrenaline that even he could not entirely suppress. He stood over Jean's body for a long moment, his head tilted slightly, as though listening for something. Then he moved through her room with practiced efficiency, taking cash from her purse, a few pieces of jewelry from her dresser, a watch that had belonged to her late husband. He wiped down the surfaces he had touched, returned to his room, and packed his belongings. By 3:30 in the morning, he had locked the front door behind him and disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness of Brussels. Jean's body was discovered 2 days later by her daughter, who had come to visit for lunch. The daughter used her key to enter the house, calling out for her mother, her voice echoing through rooms that had grown cold. She found Jean in bed, eyes closed, hands folded across her chest, a detail that disturbed investigators, as it suggested the killer had staged the scene to resemble peaceful death. But the bruises on her neck told a different story. The autopsy confirmed manual strangulation. The police investigation uncovered the recent lodger who had given a false name and paid in cash. And somewhere in the files of the Antwerp Police Department, a detective noticed the similarities to the Maria Phillips case and felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. But recognizing a pattern and stopping a killer are 2 different things. Between April 1986 and December 1987, Etienne Dedru killed at least 4 more women, possibly more. The exact number remains uncertain because not all cases were connected at the time, and some potential victims may never have been identified. But the confirmed murders follow a pattern so consistent it reads like a signature written in bruises and broken trust. In July 1986, 76-year-old Anna de Vries was found strangled in her home in Mechelen. She had rented a room to a quiet man who had disappeared the night she died. In October 1986, 69-year-old Sophia Vermeulen was discovered dead in her Ghent apartment. Her lodger vanished, her small savings stolen. In March 1987, 83-year-old Helene Durant died in her Brussels home under circumstances identical to the previous victims. And in September 1987, 74-year-old Margarita Claes became what investigators believe was Etienne's final victim, strangled in her bed in Leuven while the rest of the neighborhood slept. Each murder was an echo of the one before. Manual strangulation, theft of minimal valuables, a lodger who had recently moved in and disappeared immediately after. Each victim was an elderly widow living alone, isolated by age and circumstance, targeted because she had done nothing more threatening than offer kindness to a stranger. The method never varied. The motive remained maddeningly unclear. Etienne Dedrugue was not killing for significant financial gain. The amounts stolen were trivial, barely enough to live on for a few weeks. He was not killing in rage or passion. The murders were too controlled, too deliberate. He was killing because he could, because these women were vulnerable, because their loneliness made them easy prey, because no one was watching closely enough to see the pattern until it was too late. But patterns, once recognized, become prisons. By late 1987, Belgian police across multiple jurisdictions had begun sharing information about the string of elderly widow murders. The similarities were impossible to ignore. A task force was assembled, photographs of the victims arranged on a board in a Brussels police station. 6 faces, 6 women who had lived full lives and deserved to die surrounded by family, not alone at the hands of a man they had tried to help. Detectives pored over witness statements, trying to construct a composite sketch of the lodger who kept appearing and disappearing like a recurring nightmare. But the descriptions were frustratingly vague and often contradictory. Average height or slightly below, thin build or medium, brown hair or light brown or sandy, quiet voice, polite manner, forgettable face, a ghost. But ghosts make mistakes. And Etienne Dedrugue's mistake was simply that he existed in the world, however faintly. He had to eat, he had to sleep, he had to occupy space. And eventually, that space would intersect with the widening net of law enforcement attention. As 1987 drew to a close, Etienne was living under yet another assumed name in a small rented room in Antwerp, not far from where his killing spree had begun with Maria Phillips. He had grown more confident with each successful murder, more certain of his ability to move through society undetected. But confidence can curdle into carelessness. And when a routine police check on tenants in boarding houses, part of the intensified investigation into the widow murders, brought officers to his door in early December, something in Etienne's manner caught their attention. The way his eyes shifted when asked routine questions. The way he hesitated before providing his identification. The way he stood in the doorway as though ready to run. One of the officers, a veteran detective named Inspector Luc Vermeers, had been studying the widow murder cases for months. He had memorized the vague descriptions of the suspect, and as he looked at the thin, pale man standing before him, claiming to be a traveling salesman down on his luck, something clicked into place. Not certainty, but suspicion strong enough to act on. They asked Etienne to come to the station to answer a few questions. Just routine, they assured him. Nothing to worry about. He agreed because refusing would have been more suspicious than complying. He gathered his coat. He walked with them to their car. And as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, Etienne Dedrugue looked back at the boarding house one final time, perhaps sensing that he would never return, that the door he had just passed through was closing behind him forever. The hunt was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. The interrogation room in the Brussels Central Police Station was a study in institutional bleakness. Concrete walls painted a color that might once have been beige but had faded to something closer to despair. A metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs that scraped against linoleum when moved, and a fluorescent light that hummed with the persistence of a trapped insect. Etienne Dedrugue sat in one of those chairs, his hands folded on the table before him, his expression as neutral as a man waiting for a bus. Across from him sat Inspector Luc Vermeers and Detective Annie Claessens, both members of the task force assembled to investigate the widow murders. Between them lay a folder containing photographs of 6 dead women, witness statements, forensic reports, and a timeline that spanned nearly 2 years. Etienne looked at the folder but said nothing. The first hours of questioning followed the standard protocols, establishing identity, confirming recent addresses, asking about employment history. Etienne answered in the same soft, polite voice he had used with his victims, providing just enough information to seem cooperative without offering anything substantive. He gave them a name that investigators already suspected was false. He claimed to have worked odd jobs that could not be verified. He said he had rented rooms in various cities, but could not remember the exact addresses or the names of his landladies. His memory, he explained with apologetic vagueness, was not very good. Inspector Vermeers watched him carefully throughout these exchanges, noting the inconsistencies, the evasions, the way Etienne's eyes would sometimes focus on a point just past the inspector's shoulder, as though he were seeing through the walls to somewhere else entirely. Vermeers had been a police officer for 23 years. He had interviewed rapists and murderers, con artists and thieves, and he had developed an instinct for when someone was performing rather than answering. Etienne Dedrugue was performing. Every word, every gesture, every expression was calculated to present a version of himself that was harmless, forgettable, beneath suspicion. But the calculation itself was the tell. After 4 hours, Vermeers opened the folder and spread the photographs of the victims across the table. Maria Phillips, Jean Goossens, Anna de Vries, Sophia Vermeulen, Helene Durant, Margarita Clays. 6 women, their faces captured in life from family photographs, their eyes holding the light that had been extinguished by the man now sitting across the table. Vermeers placed them deliberately, creating a gallery of the dead, and then he looked at Etienne and asked the question that would define the next several days. "Do you recognize any of these women?" Etienne looked at the photographs. His expression did not change. Not a flicker of recognition. Not a hint of guilt or fear or even curiosity. He studied each face with the detached interest of someone examining paintings in a museum, and then he shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I don't recognize them. Should I?" "They're all dead," Detective Klassen said, her voice harder than Vermeers's, edged with the controlled anger of someone who had spent weeks imagining the final moments of these women's lives. Strangled in their own beds. Each one had recently taken in a male lodger who disappeared the night they died. Each one fits the pattern perfectly. And you, Monsieur Dedrugue, if that's even your real name, fit the description of that lodger. Etienne met her gaze without flinching. "I've rented many rooms," he said. "I move frequently, but I've never hurt anyone. I'm a peaceful man." The interrogation continued for 3 more days, a grinding war of attrition in which investigators presented evidence and Etienne deflected with maddening consistency. They showed him rental advertisements from newspapers, dates that aligned with the murders, neighborhoods where he had been seen. He admitted nothing. They presented witness statements from neighbors who described a quiet lodger matching his appearance. He suggested they were mistaken, that many men fit such a vague description. They brought in a forensic psychologist who profiled him as a textbook case of a serial killer targeting vulnerable women, organized, methodical, devoid of empathy. Etienne listened politely and said the psychologist was entitled to his opinion, but opinions were not evidence. And that was the problem. Physical evidence was minimal. Etienne had been meticulous about wiping down surfaces, leaving no fingerprints. But more importantly, the address of the rooming house was only 3 blocks from Sophia's home, and buried in the belongings that had been confiscated when Etienne was brought in for questioning was a small leather wallet containing identification cards in multiple names, one of which matched the name on that registration card. When Vermeers confronted him with this evidence, Etienne's expression finally changed. Not dramatically, no collapse into confession, no tears or rage, just a subtle tightening around his eyes, a slight compression of his lips. The mask slipped for less than a second, but it was enough. Vermeers saw it, Klassen saw it, and they knew they had found the crack in his armor. Over the next 2 days, investigators systematically dismantled Etienne's story, cross-referencing dates and locations, building a timeline that placed him near every single murder at exactly the right time. They found a pawnshop owner in Mechelen who remembered a thin, quiet man selling a woman's watch that matched the description of the one stolen from Anna de Vries. They located a landlord in Brussels who identified Etienne from a photograph as the man who had rented a room under a false name and left without notice the same week Helene Durant was killed. Each piece of evidence was small, but together they formed a chain that wrapped around Etienne's neck as surely as his hands had wrapped around his victims' throats. Finally, on the 6th day of interrogation, Inspector Vermeers placed a tape recorder on the table between them and said, "We know what you did. We know how you did it. We have enough evidence to ensure you never leave prison. But what we don't understand is why. These women trusted you. They helped you. Why did you kill them? For a long time, Etienne said nothing. The fluorescent light hummed above them. The tape recorder spun in silence. And then, almost as an afterthought, as though he were commenting on something of no particular importance, Etienne spoke. They were easy, he said. Vermeers waited, but Etienne offered nothing more. Easy? The inspector prompted. Easy to approach. Easy to gain access to. Easy to kill. Etienne's voice remained flat, emotionless, as though he were describing the process of changing a tire rather than murdering 6 human beings. They wanted company. I provided it. They trusted quickly. That made everything simple. And the strangling? Detective Claessens asked, her voice tight. Why that method? Etienne looked at her as though the answer should be obvious. Quiet, he said. No noise. No mess. Just wait until they stop moving. It's practical. The word practical hung in the air like something poisonous. Vermeers felt his hands curl into fists beneath the table, but he kept his voice level. Did they beg? Did they ask you why? Some tried to speak, Etienne said with a shrug. But once you close the windpipe, speech becomes impossible. So no, they didn't really say anything. They just looked at me. And what did you feel when they looked at you? Etienne considered this question with the same mild interest he had shown throughout the interrogation. Nothing, he said finally. I felt nothing. They were obstacles between me and what I wanted. Once they were removed, I moved on. It was simple. This confession, if it could be called that, would become the foundation of the prosecution's case. Etienne Dedrugue was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of theft, and various other offenses related to identity fraud and breaking and entering. His trial began in September 1988 in a Brussels courtroom that was packed with journalists, family members of the victims, and members of the public who wanted to understand how someone could commit such acts with such complete absence of remorse. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented the timeline, the physical evidence, the testimony of witnesses who had seen Etienne near the crime scenes. They brought in the pawnshop owner, the landlords, the neighbors. They played the tape of Etienne's confession, his flat voice describing murder as though it were a household chore. The defense attempted to argue that the confession had been coerced, that the evidence was circumstantial, that reasonable doubt existed. But the weight of accumulated proof was overwhelming. Etienne Dedrugue had killed 6 women in cold blood, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. The families of the victims attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery with photographs of their mothers and grandmothers clutched in their hands. They listened as the prosecution described how Maria Phillips had clawed at Etienne's wrists while he strangled her. They heard how Jean Goossens had kicked her heels against the bed frame in a desperate, futile attempt to alert someone. They learned that Anna de Vries had been found with her nightgown torn, suggesting she had fought harder than her frail body should have allowed. Each detail was a fresh wound, a new layer of grief piled on top of loss. When Etienne took the stand in his own defense, he offered no apology. He expressed no regret. He answered questions in the same polite, emotionless tone he had used with investigators, describing his actions as though they were things that had simply happened, disconnected from any moral consequence. The prosecutor asked him if he understood that he had destroyed families, that he had taken away mothers and grandmothers, that he had caused immeasurable pain. Etienne looked at the prosecutor and said, I understand that they're dead. I understand that I caused their deaths. But pain is what the living feel. I wasn't concerned with the living. The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order. And in the gallery, the daughter of Maria Phillips wept into her hands while her husband held her, whispering comfort that could not possibly be adequate. On October 12, 1988, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Etienne Dedrugue to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, 6 life sentences, to be served consecutively, ensuring he would die behind bars. As the sentence was read, Etienne showed no reaction. He simply stood, allowed the guards to handcuff him, and was led from the courtroom without looking back at the families whose lives he had shattered. He disappeared into the Belgian prison system, a ghost finally given form and walls. The Merksplaas prison in northern Belgium is a fortress built to contain men who have forfeited their right to live among society. High walls of weathered stone surround exercise yards where prisoners move in tight circles like animals in diminished habitats. Guard towers stand sentinel at each corner, their searchlights cutting through darkness every night, ensuring that what is locked inside remains locked inside. This is where Etienne Dedroog would spend the rest of his life, not in isolation, which might have granted him a perverse kind of importance, but in general population, where he became just another number, another aging man in a gray prison uniform, unremarkable among the unremarkable. Prison records indicate that Etienne adapted to incarceration with the same emotionless efficiency he had brought to his murders. He followed the rules. He kept to himself. He never caused trouble. Guards who supervised him during his first years at Merksplaas described him as cooperative but distant, a man who seemed to exist behind a pane of glass that separated him from every other human being. He did not make friends among the other inmates. He did not join any of the informal social groups that form even in prisons. He spent most of his time in the prison library, reading books on history and geography, subjects that allowed him to travel in his mind through places he would never physically see again. Other prisoners, learning what he had done, kept their distance. Even in a population of criminals, there are hierarchies of contempt, and those who prey on the elderly, particularly elderly women, occupy one of the lowest rungs. Etienne received no threats, no violence, but he was shunned with a thoroughness that might have broken a man who craved human connection. But Etienne Dedroog had never craved connection. He had craved only access, control, and the specific satisfaction that came from watching the light leave someone's eyes while his hands remained steady on their throat. Denied that satisfaction, he simply withdrew further into himself, becoming a human shell going through the motions of existence without any apparent investment in whether that existence continued. He never expressed remorse. In the decades following his conviction, Etienne participated in exactly 3 psychological evaluations, mandatory assessments conducted at 5-year intervals to determine if he posed any risk of reoffending should he ever be released, though his sentence structure made release impossible. Each evaluation produced a report that read like a photocopy of the one before it. The prison psychologists noted his flat affect, his inability or unwillingness to demonstrate empathy, his complete absence of emotional connection to his crimes. In the 1993 evaluation, Dr. Henrik Vandenberg wrote, "Subject shows no evidence of remorse or moral understanding of his actions. When asked about his victims, he refers to them in past tense with the same emotional inflection one might use to describe furniture that has been removed from a room. He understands intellectually that society deems his actions wrong, but this understanding exists purely as external information rather than internalized moral conviction." The 1998 evaluation was even more chilling. Dr. Sophie Martens noted, when pressed to explain why he chose elderly widows specifically, subjects stated that they were available and unguarded. When asked if he had considered the fear and suffering he inflicted, he paused for several seconds, not in emotional reflection, but as though calculating an appropriate response. He then said, "Fear is a response to threat. I was the threat. The logic follows naturally." There is no indication that this man has developed any capacity for empathy in the 10 years since his incarceration. He remains a profound danger, though his danger is now contained. But while Etienne's emotions remained frozen in whatever wasteland existed behind his eyes, the impact of his crimes continued to ripple outward through the lives of those who survived his victims. The families he had shattered did not have the luxury of emotional disconnection. They lived with the aftermath every single day. Maria Phillips's daughter, Elizabeth, moved back to Belgium from Germany within months of her mother's murder. She sold her mother's house, could not bear to enter it, let alone live in it, and used the money to establish a small foundation that provided security systems to elderly people living alone. The foundation still operates today, decades later, installing door alarms and emergency call buttons in the homes of vulnerable seniors. Elizabeth never spoke publicly about her mother's death except once, in a 1995 interview with a Belgian newspaper, when she said, My mother's last moments were filled with terror and betrayal. She died knowing that her kindness had been weaponized against her. Cannot change that, but I can try to prevent it from happening to someone else's mother. Gene Goossens' son, Mark, developed severe anxiety disorder following his mother's murder. He began checking and rechecking the locks on his own doors dozens of times each night, unable to sleep until he had verified every possible entry point into his home. His marriage deteriorated under the strain of his obsessive behaviors and his inability to trust anyone outside his immediate family. In therapy sessions, mandated by his employer after his performance deteriorated, Mark described recurring nightmares in which he arrived at his mother's house and found her still alive, still struggling, still looking at him with desperate eyes, silently begging him to save her. But in the dreams, he was always paralyzed, always unable to move or speak or help. He would wake soaked in sweat, his heart hammering, the guilt of not having been there mixing with the irrational but overwhelming feeling that he should have somehow known, should have sensed his mother was in danger. The pattern repeated across all 6 families. Anna de Vries's granddaughter developed a pathological distrust of strangers that made maintaining relationships nearly impossible. Sophia Vermeulen's nephew became a police officer, joining the force explicitly to hunt predators like the one who had killed his aunt, burning himself out within 8 years and resigning with stress-related health problems. Helene Durant's daughter refused to live alone for the rest of her life, always maintaining a roommate or companion, unable to sleep in a house where she was the only person breathing. Margarita Claes's family scattered across Europe, each member unable to be in the same room with the others without the specter of their collective loss making conversation impossible. The survivors were haunted not just by the deaths themselves, but by the specific nature of the betrayal. Their loved ones had not been killed by random intruders or strangers attacking on dark streets. They had been killed by someone they had invited in, someone they had fed and housed and trusted. The violation was intimate in a way that made it impossible to process. Home, the place that should represent ultimate safety, had been transformed into the site of ultimate vulnerability. Kindness, the impulse that should connect humans to each other, had been transformed into a fatal mistake. The families struggled with questions that had no satisfying answers. Should their mothers have been more suspicious, more cautious, less kind? But to become the kind of person who trusts no one is to become a different kind of victim, one whose humanity has been eroded by fear. Meanwhile, in the broader society, the case of the lodger's killer prompted a wave of changes in how Belgium approached the safety of its elderly population. Police departments implemented new protocols for tracking transient individuals, requiring more thorough identification verification at boarding houses and rental properties. Social services expanded wellness check programs, ensuring that isolated seniors received regular visits from trained personnel who could assess their living situations. Newspapers began running awareness campaigns, warning elderly homeowners about the dangers of taking in lodgers without proper background checks. But these practical changes could not address the deeper psychological wound that Etienne Dedroug had inflicted on the collective consciousness. In neighborhoods across Belgium, elderly widows who had once welcomed company began deadbolting their doors and refusing to answer knocks from anyone they didn't recognize. The classified advertisement sections of newspapers saw a dramatic decline in room-for-rent postings from single elderly homeowners. A culture of fear took root, one that was arguably necessary for safety but tragic in its necessity. The social isolation that had made Etienne's victims vulnerable in the first place now deepened as potential victims withdrew further into themselves, choosing loneliness over the risk of letting anyone close. Journalists and true crime writers have examined the case extensively over the decades, trying to understand what created Etienne Dedroug. Investigators dug into his childhood and found a story that was disturbing in its ordinariness. No evidence of severe abuse, no dramatic trauma that might explain his complete absence of empathy. He was raised by parents who were described as cold and distant but not actively cruel. He had been an unremarkable student, neither brilliant nor struggling, who simply moved through school without making an impression on anyone. Former classmates interviewed years later struggled to remember him at all, describing him as the kind of person you wouldn't notice even if he was standing right in front of you. Some psychologists theorized that Etienne suffered from antisocial personality disorder combined with psychopathic traits, a clinical explanation that provided vocabulary but not comfort. Others suggested that his crimes represented a twisted form of power acquisition, that a man who had moved through life without ever making an impact finally found a way to matter, even if that mattering was entirely negative. But Etienne himself never provided any insight. In the rare prison interviews he granted, usually to academic researchers studying criminal psychology, he offered only surface-level responses, describing his actions in mechanical terms without ever illuminating the darkness that motivated them. "Why did you do it?" researchers would ask, rephrasing the question in dozens of different ways, hoping to find the angle that would crack open his psyche. "Because I could," he would answer, always returning to variations of that same response. "Because it was possible. Because they made it easy." The simplicity of his evil was perhaps its most disturbing aspect. There was no grand philosophy, no twisted moral justification, no attempt to position himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. He killed because the opportunity presented itself and he felt no internal resistance to seizing it. He killed because the emotional mechanism that stops most people from strangling an elderly widow in her sleep simply did not exist in whatever space his conscience should have occupied. As the years accumulated and Etienne aged in his cell at Merksplass prison, the world outside continued to change in ways both profound and subtle. The Cold War ended. The European Union expanded. Technology transformed communication, making the kind of anonymous drifting that Etienne had practiced increasingly difficult. DNA databases and digital records created webs of accountability that would have made his crimes much harder to commit in modern times. The serial killers who dominated headlines in the 1970s and 1980s became rarer, their methods obsolete in an age of surveillance cameras and cell phone tracking. But the fundamental vulnerabilities that Etienne had exploited, loneliness, trust, the human need for connection, remained unchanged. Elderly people still lived alone. They still needed help. They still yearned for company. And while the specific method of predation might evolve, the core dynamic of a predator identifying and exploiting the vulnerable continued in countless variations. Etienne Dedrugue was not unique in his evil. He was simply efficient in its application. In 2008, 20 years after his conviction, a Belgian television documentary revisited the case, interviewing investigators, family members, and criminal psychologists. The documentary included footage of Merksplass prison but did not interview Etienne himself. He had refused all media requests for over a decade by that point. Inspector Luc Vermeers, retired by then and in his 70s, appeared in the documentary looking tired and haunted. When asked if he thought justice had been served, he was quiet for a long moment before answering. "He's in prison," Vermeers said finally. "He will die in prison. In that sense, yes, justice was served. But those 6 women are still dead. Their families are still broken. And the truth is that we caught him partly through good police work and partly through luck. He made just enough small mistakes that we could build a case. If he had been slightly more careful, he might have killed a dozen more before we found him. That thought keeps me awake some nights. Even now, justice feels very small when measured against that possibility." The documentary also featured a brief interview with Elizabeth Phillips, Maria's daughter, who was in her 60s by then. She had never visited Etienne in prison and had no desire to confront him. "What would be the point?" she asked the interviewer. "He cannot give me what I want, which is my mother back. He cannot give me what I need, which is an explanation that makes sense of something senseless. The man is a void. You cannot get answers from a void. You can only acknowledge that it exists and make sure it remains contained." In 2016, Etienne Dedrugue died in the prison infirmary at Merksplass at the age of 70. The official cause of death was pneumonia, though his overall health had been deteriorating for years. He spent his final weeks in the prison hospital ward, refusing most medical interventions, seemingly indifferent to whether he recovered or died. The prison chaplain visited him multiple times during those final weeks, hoping to prompt some kind of deathbed confession or expression of remorse. But Etienne remained true to form until the very end. He listened to the chaplain politely, thanked him for his concern, and offered nothing resembling repentance. On his final day, as his breathing grew labored and his consciousness faded, a nurse asked if he wanted her to contact anyone, if there was anyone in the world he wanted to see. He shook his head slightly and closed his eyes. He died alone, as his victims had died alone, though his solitude was chosen while theirs had been forced upon them. His death was noted in a few Belgian newspapers with brief articles that recounted his crimes and confirmed his passing. There were no mourners at his funeral. His body was cremated at state expense, and his ashes were disposed of without ceremony. In death, as in life, Etienne Dedrugue disappeared without leaving a mark, except for the marks his hands had left on the throats of 6 women who had made the mistake of being kind. The families received notification of his death through official channels. Some felt relief, a particular kind of burden lifted knowing that the man who killed their loved ones could never again draw breath. Others felt nothing at all, or rather felt the same numb ache that had become their baseline emotional state years ago. A few experienced unexpected anger that he had been allowed to die of natural causes after a long life, while their mothers and grandmothers had been robbed of their final years and died in terror. Today, more than 35 years after Etienne Dedrugue's conviction, the case remains a subject of study in criminal justice programs across Europe. It is cited in textbooks on serial homicide, used as an example of organized offenders who target specific victim populations. Criminology students write papers analyzing his modus operandi, his victim selection criteria, his ability to evade capture for as long as he did. The case files sit in archives, available to researchers who want to understand the mechanics of a particular kind of predatory behavior. But for the families of Maria Phillips, Jean Goossens, Anna de Vries, Sophia Vermeulen, Helene Durant, and Margarita Clays, the case is not academic. It is the reason for empty chairs at holiday dinners. It is the source of nightmares that persist decades after the murders. It is the answer to the question they must give when someone asks, "What happened to your mother?" It is the permanent scar tissue that forms around a wound that never fully heals. In Maria Phillips's former neighborhood in Antwerp, her house still stands, though it has been sold and resold multiple times since her death. The current owners know nothing of what happened there in December 1985. They have painted the walls, replaced the flooring, renovated the kitchen. But the bones of the house remain the same. The stairs Etienne descended that night, the hallway he moved through, the bedroom where Maria died. The house has been scrubbed of his presence, but not of the memory of what occurred within its walls. The same is true across Belgium, in the neighborhoods where the other victims lived and died. Their homes have been repurposed, inhabited by people who have no connection to the tragedies that unfolded there. Life continues in those spaces because it must, because we do not abandon every place where something terrible has happened. But the past remains embedded in the architecture, invisible but indelible. What remains in the end is a story, a true story about 6 women who deserved to live out their lives in peace and dignity, and the man who decided they should not. It is a story about the dark side of human trust, about the terrible vulnerability that comes with kindness, about the predators who move among us wearing the mask of normalcy. It is a story that refuses the comfort of easy explanations or redemptive endings. Etienne Dedrugue was not a monster in the sense that monsters exist outside the realm of humanity. He was a human being who made choices, calculated, deliberate, evil choices, and those choices destroyed lives. He walked through the world as we all do, breathing the same air, occupying the same spaces, but he carried inside himself a fundamental absence where conscience should reside. And that absence, given opportunity and access, became lethal. The lesson, if there is one, is not that we should stop being kind or stop trusting others. A world without kindness and trust is not a world worth living in. But the lesson might be that we need to protect our most vulnerable with the same intensity that predators pursue them. That we need to check on our elderly neighbors, ensure they are not isolated, make sure they know they do not have to bear their loneliness to the point where it makes them reckless with their own safety. The story of Etienne Dedrugue and his victims is a reminder that evil is not always dramatic or theatrical. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it knocks politely at the door, carrying a worn suitcase, speaking in soft tones, asking for nothing more than a place to stay. Sometimes it says thank you for the tea, Sometimes it waits until midnight to reveal what it truly is. And sometimes, by the time you realize you have welcomed it into your home, it is already too late to scream. The 6 women whose names have been repeated throughout this narrative, Maria, Jean, Anna, Sophia, Helene, and Margarita, were more than victims. They were mothers, grandmothers, wives, friends, neighbors. They lived full lives before Etienne Dedrugue entered them. They survived wars, raised families, experienced joy and sorrow, celebrated birthdays and mourned losses. They were complete human beings with complex interior lives, with memories and dreams and disappointments. They deserved to die surrounded by love, holding the hands of children and grandchildren who would mourn them properly and remember them fully. Instead, they died alone in the dark, their last sight the expressionless face of a man who felt nothing as he took everything from them. That is the injustice that persists beyond Etienne's imprisonment and death. That is the wound that cannot be closed by justice or time. That is the echo that continues to sound in empty rooms where photographs of elderly women gather dust on mantelpieces, waiting for visitors who come less frequently now, who find it too painful to sit in those rooms and remember. The house Maria Phillips once filled with life is quiet now. Different furniture sits in different places. Different people sleep in different beds. The grandfather clock that marked time the night she died has been sold or discarded. But somewhere in the structure of that building, in the grain of the wood, in the molecules of air, in the memory embedded in brick and mortar, her final moments remain. Not as a ghost or supernatural presence, but as historical fact. As truth, as something that happened and cannot be unhappened. This is the weight that Etienne Dedrugue left behind when he died in a prison bed, unmourned and unrepentant. This is the burden carried forward by everyone who loved the women he killed. This is the legacy of the lodger's killer, not the infamy of his name or the analysis of his methods, but the 6 absences he created in the world, 6 spaces where life should have continued but instead stopped cold beneath his hands. And if there is any redemption to be found in telling this story, it is only this, that these women are remembered not merely as victims, but as human beings who lived and mattered and deserved better than the death they received. Their names should be spoken aloud. Their lives should be acknowledged. Their ending should serve as a warning and a call to vigilance, so that others might be spared the same fate. Maria Phillips, Jean Goossens, Anna de Vries, Sophia Vermeulen, Helene Durant, Margarita Clays, say their names, remember them, let their stories be told not to glorify their killer, but to honor their interrupted lives and ensure that the kindness they extended to a stranger, kindness that cost them everything, is not forgotten in the shadow of the evil that exploited it. This is their story. This is what remains when the monster dies and only the damage endures. This is what we owe the dead. The truth, spoken clearly, so that the living might learn to protect what is precious before it is too late. The doors are locked now. The windows are bolted. The lights stay on through the night. But somewhere, in homes across the world, elderly people still live alone, still grow lonely, still yearn for connection. And somewhere, predators still read advertisements, still knock on doors, still wear masks of normalcy over faces of nothing. The story of Etienne Dedrugue is finished. But the vigilance his crimes demand continues, must continue, will continue for as long as the vulnerable need protection and the strong have the capacity to provide it. That is the only ending this story can have. Not closure, but continuation. Not healing, but awareness. Not forgetting, but remembering, always remembering, so that 6 women who died in darkness might finally rest in the light of truth told and lessons learned. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe, so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Vampire of Musin. Blood doesn't lie, but the man who spills it always does. They found the first body drained of nearly every drop of blood, puncture wounds decorating the neck like some grotesque necklace. The second victim bore the same marks. Then the third. By the time investigators connected the dots, a seemingly ordinary maintenance worker had already perfected his ritual, drinking the life from his victims while they were still warm, still twitching, still clinging to their final heartbeats. This is the story of Staff van Eycken, the monster who prowled the quiet streets of Muizen, Belgium, transforming ordinary afternoons into blood-soaked nightmares. A predator who didn't just kill, he consumed. A man who turned murder into communion and terror into his daily bread. Welcome to the darkest corner of human depravity, where the line between man and monster dissolved in a pool of arterial spray. Staff van Eycken looked like everybody's neighbor. Average height, unremarkable features, the kind of face that disappeared into crowds at the grocery store or the post office. He worked maintenance at a retirement home in Muizen, a small municipality in Belgium's Flemish region, where cobblestone streets whispered with centuries of history and residents prided themselves on knowing everyone's business. Or so they thought. Behind that ordinary facade lived something extraordinary in its monstrosity. Van Eycken harbored appetites that would have made medieval inquisitors blanch. He didn't just fantasize about death. He craved it with the intensity most people reserve for love or ambition. More specifically, he craved blood. Not as metaphor, not as symbol, but as sustenance, as sacrament, as the liquid key that unlocked something primal and unspeakable inside him. His childhood offered few obvious warning signs, at least none that anyone recognized until it was far too late. Born in 1969, Van Eycken grew up in an era when Belgium was still processing the trauma of its own violent past, when the scars of 2 world wars still marked the landscape both physically and psychologically. His family was working class, neither affluent nor destitute, neither remarkable nor particularly troubled by outward appearances. But inside the developing mind of young Staff, something twisted. Early on, he displayed what psychologists would later term ideation of a violent sexual nature. He fantasized about control, about domination, about reducing other human beings to objects that existed solely for his gratification. Animals became his first victims. Cats, dogs, whatever creatures had the misfortune of crossing his path. He didn't just kill them. He experimented with them, discovering which methods produced the most blood, which techniques kept them alive longest while he indulged his curiosity. His teenage years passed without major incident, at least none that came to light. He recognized that a certain number of deaths would go unquestioned, would be attributed to the frailties of age rather than any external cause. All he needed was patience, and careful selection, and the willingness to wait for exactly the right moment. His first kill, at least the first one authorities would later confirm, occurred on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn. The victim was an elderly woman named Marie, though Van Eycken never thought of her by name. To him, she was simply an opportunity. She had no close family, received visitors rarely, and spent most of her days alone in her room, staring out the window at a world that had largely forgotten her existence. Van Eycken watched her routine for weeks. He knew when the nurses made their rounds. He knew which staff members cut corners on their duties. He knew the precise window of time when Marie would be utterly, completely alone. When he entered her room that afternoon, she looked up with the vague confusion common to dementia patients. She didn't recognize him specifically, but she recognized the uniform, the appearance of authority. She trusted him. That trust would be her last mistake. What happened next took less than 15 minutes but would echo through decades. Van Eycken moved with practiced efficiency. He overpowered her easily. She was frail, her bones bird hollow, her strength long since departed. He produced a knife, something small and sharp that he had stolen from the kitchen weeks earlier. And then he began his ritual. The first cut was tentative, almost experimental. He pierced the soft flesh of her neck, just above the collarbone, and watched as blood welled up in the wound. Bright red, almost impossibly vivid against her pale skin. He felt something surge inside him, a euphoria that bordered on religious ecstasy. This was what he had been waiting for. This was the moment when fantasy became reality. He leaned down and pressed his mouth to the wound, tasting the metallic warmth of her blood. Marie struggled weakly beneath him, her feeble attempts at resistance only heightening his excitement. He drank deeply, feeling the blood coat his throat, fill his mouth, sustain him in ways that food and water never could. When he finally pulled away, Marie's struggles had ceased. Her eyes stared at nothing, her face locked in an expression of terminal confusion. Van Eycken felt satisfied in a way he had never experienced before. This wasn't just murder. This was communion. This was transcendence. He spent several minutes arranging the scene. He cleaned the blood from his face and hands. He positioned Marie's body to suggest natural causes, a heart attack, perhaps, or a stroke. In an elderly woman with multiple health conditions, such a death would surprise no one. He slipped out of the room as quietly as he had entered, his pulse barely elevated, his hands steady. Marie's body was discovered the next morning during routine rounds. A nurse checked for a pulse, found none, and initiated the standard protocols for death in a care facility. A doctor was summoned. He examined the body briefly, noted Marie's advanced age and medical history, and signed the death certificate without hesitation. Cause of death: cardiac arrest. The small puncture wound on her neck, partially hidden by the collar of her nightgown, went unnoticed. Van Eycken attended Marie's funeral. He stood at the back of the nearly empty chapel, one of only a handful of staff members who bothered to pay their respects. He listened to the priest's generic homilies about eternal rest and God's mercy. He watched as they lowered her coffin into the ground, and he felt nothing but anticipation for the next time, because there would be a next time, and another after that, and another. The monster had tasted blood, and no force on earth could make him stop now. For Van Eycken, murder wasn't about anger or revenge or even sexual gratification in the conventional sense. It was about power, yes, but more than that, it was about need. He needed to drink blood the way other people needed air or water. It had become as fundamental to his existence as breathing. Without it, he felt incomplete, hollow, purposeless. With it, he felt alive in ways that transcended normal human experience. He began to plan his next victim even before Marie's grave had settled. The retirement home was full of potential targets, each one representing another opportunity to feed his hunger. He would be more careful this time, more precise in his technique. He would refine his method until it became an art form. The retirement home continued its daily routines, oblivious to the predator in its midst. Residents shuffled through their final days. Staff members went through their motions, providing care that ranged from competent to barely adequate. And Staff Van Eycken moved among them all, unseen and unsuspected, already selecting his next victim. The elderly woman's death had been written off as natural, unremarkable in a place where death was the ultimate inevitability. No investigation followed. No questions were asked. The system had performed exactly as Van Eycken had anticipated, and in doing so, it had given him permission to continue. What nobody understood yet was that they hadn't just missed a murder. They had failed to recognize the birth of something far worse. A serial killer who had found his perfect hunting ground, his ideal method, and his ultimate satisfaction. The vampire of Muizen had claimed his first victim, and he was just getting started. The autumn leaves fell outside Marie's former window, covering the ground in shades of red and brown that matched the stains Van Eycken had so carefully cleaned from her room. Winter approached, bringing with it longer nights and deeper shadows. Perfect conditions for a predator who had learned to kill in plain sight. Somewhere in the retirement home, another elderly resident sat alone in their room, unaware that they had just been selected. Unaware that Staff Van Eycken had already begun to study their routine, mapping the moments when they would be most vulnerable. Unaware that their final days had been counted and numbered by a man who saw them not as human beings but as vessels, containers of the precious fluid he craved above all else. The monster wore a maintenance uniform and a friendly smile. He knew everyone's name. He fixed their problems and made their lives easier. And when the time came, when the corridors were empty and the staff was distracted and the moment was exactly right, he would enter their room and transform their world into a nightmare that would end only with their final heartbeat. This was just the beginning. The body count was about to rise, and the methods would become increasingly bold, increasingly brutal. But for now, in those final months of an unremarkable year, Staff Van Eycken was simply a maintenance worker who had gotten away with murder. And that success tasted almost as sweet as the blood itself. The retirement home in Muizen stood as a monument to society's uncomfortable relationship with aging and death. Built in the 1970s with all the aesthetic charm of Soviet-era architecture, it housed approximately 80 residents across 3 floors connected by elevators that groaned and stuttered with mechanical arthritis. The walls were painted in colors meant to be cheerful, but instead projected a kind of aggressive optimism that felt almost mocking given the institution's primary function: warehousing the elderly until they died. Staff Van Eycken knew every corridor, every supply closet, every blind spot where security cameras failed to reach. He had studied the building's geography with the intensity of a military strategist planning an invasion. He understood the rhythm of shift changes, the patterns of staff movement, the precise moments when sections of the facility fell into temporary neglect. This knowledge transformed the retirement home from a workplace into a hunting ground, a private preserve where prey gathered in convenient concentration. His second victim was a man named Joseph, 83 years old, a former factory worker whose children lived abroad and visited perhaps twice a year. Joseph occupied a room on the second floor, at the end of a hallway that saw less traffic than other areas. His health was declining, but not catastrophically. He was mobile enough to shuffle to the dining hall for meals, coherent enough to watch television and complain about the food. In other words, he was perfect. Van Eycken began his ritual of observation. He noted when Joseph took his afternoon nap, when he used the bathroom, when he sat alone in his room with the door slightly ajar, inviting interaction. The old man was lonely, desperate for human contact, which made him vulnerable in ways that went beyond the merely physical. Loneliness was its own kind of weakness, one that Van Eycken exploited with predatory precision. He cultivated a relationship with Joseph over several weeks. Brief conversations in the hallway, small acts of kindness, adjusting the temperature in his room, bringing him a newspaper from the common area, fixing a lamp that had stopped working. Joseph began to look forward to these interactions, to see Van Eycken as a friend rather than merely staff. Trust accumulated slowly, invisibly, until the old man thought nothing of it when Van Eycken entered his room one winter afternoon and closed the door behind him. The attack was swifter this time, more confident. Van Eycken had learned from his first kill, had refined his technique. He subdued Joseph with brutal efficiency, using a combination of surprise and overwhelming force. The old man barely had time to register what was happening before the knife found his throat. But this time, Van Eycken didn't stop at the neck. He made multiple incisions, along the inner arms where veins ran close to the surface, at the thighs where femoral arteries pulsed with life-sustaining blood. He wanted more this time, needed more. One small wound wasn't enough to satisfy the hunger that consumed him. He needed to feel the blood flow freely, needed to position himself to catch it as it poured from Joseph's body. The old man's struggles weakened quickly. Blood loss induces a cascade of physiological failures: confusion, weakness, loss of consciousness, cardiac arrest. Joseph experienced all of these in rapid succession while Van Eycken crouched over him, drinking from the wounds like some creature from nightmare folklore. The experience was transcendent, overwhelming, almost spiritual in its intensity. Van Eycken felt connected to something primal and ancient, as if he had tapped into an appetite that predated civilization itself. When Joseph finally stopped breathing, Van Eycken remained with the body for several minutes, savoring the aftermath. The room smelled of blood and death, scents that most people would find repulsive, but which Van Eycken inhaled deeply, committing them to memory. He felt sated in a way that normal meals never accomplished, as if the blood had nourished not just his body but his soul. The cleanup was more challenging this time. Multiple wounds meant more blood, more evidence to eliminate. Van Eycken worked methodically, using towels and cleaning supplies he had brought with him. He bundled the blood-soaked materials into bags he would later dispose of in the building's industrial-sized dumpsters, where they would be buried under tons of regular trash and eventually hauled away to a landfill. He arranged Joseph's body carefully, positioning it to suggest a fall. Perhaps the old man had gotten dizzy, had collapsed and struck his head. The wounds would need explanation, but Van Eycken gambled that in an overtaxed healthcare system, with overworked staff and limited resources, a thorough examination was unlikely. He was right. Joseph's body was discovered that evening when he failed to appear for dinner. A nurse found him on the floor, blood pooled around him, obviously deceased. She called for help, but there was no urgency. The man was clearly beyond saving. An ambulance arrived. Paramedics confirmed death. The body was transported to a morgue where a cursory examination concluded that Joseph had suffered a catastrophic fall, possibly after a stroke or heart attack. The wounds, while noted, were attributed to the trauma of falling against furniture. The blood loss was consistent with the injuries observed. Nothing suggested foul play. Again, Van Eycken had killed in plain sight and walked away undetected. The system designed to protect vulnerable populations had failed twice now, and each failure emboldened him further. He attended Joseph's funeral as well, this time feeling a strange sense of ownership over the proceedings. These people were mourning a death they didn't understand, grieving a murder they couldn't recognize. Their ignorance was almost insulting, but it was also useful. As long as they remained blind, he remained free. The success of his second kill broke something inside Van Eycken, or perhaps it freed something that had always been there, straining against internal restraints. The time between victims began to shorten. His hunger, temporarily sated, returned more quickly and more intensely. He found himself thinking constantly about blood, about the taste and texture of it, about the euphoria of drinking it fresh from a dying body. The thoughts consumed him, dominated his waking hours, invaded his dreams. His third victim was a woman named Clara, 79 years old, suffering from advanced Parkinson's disease. Her tremors were severe, her mobility limited, her communication abilities compromised by medication and neurological decline. She was utterly defenseless, completely dependent on staff for every aspect of her care. Van Eycken selected her not out of mercy, but because she represented easy prey. He killed Clara in her bed during a night shift when staffing was minimal and supervision lax. He entered her room at 3 in the morning, that dead hour when human vigilance reaches its lowest ebb. Clara was awake. Parkinson's often disrupts sleep patterns, but her ability to call for help was limited. Van Eycken approached her bed with the knife already drawn. This time, he focused on volume. He wanted as much blood as possible, and he had learned that multiple smaller wounds bled more profusely than single large ones. He made precise incisions along both arms, both legs, at the neck and chest. Clara's body became a network of leaking wounds, blood flowing freely onto the sheets, soaking into the mattress. Van Eycken positioned himself to drink directly from the wounds, moving from one to another as blood flow slowed, seeking out fresh sources. The experience lasted longer this time. Clara's heart, weakened but still functional, continued pumping blood for several minutes. Van Eycken rode out each heartbeat, feeling the pulsing flow against his lips, sustaining himself on her life force. When Clara finally died, Van Eycken was drenched in her blood, covered his clothes, his hands, his face. For a moment, he experienced something approaching panic. How could he possibly clean this up? How could he walk out of this room without leaving a trail of evidence that would lead directly to him? But panic gave way to problem-solving. He stripped off his outer clothing, which he had worn specifically because it could be disposed of. Underneath, he wore clean clothes. He cleaned his skin with towels and cleaning solution. He worked quickly but thoroughly, aware that time was limited but also that rushing would lead to mistakes. The room itself was a massacre scene. Blood had spread far beyond what could be easily concealed. Van Eycken made a decision. He would leave it. He would make Clara's death so obviously violent that it couldn't possibly be attributed to natural causes. But he would also ensure that no evidence pointed to him specifically. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses. He left Clara's room at 4:30 in the morning, carrying bags of blood-soaked clothing and towels. He moved through empty corridors, descending to the basement where the laundry and maintenance facilities were located. He disposed of the evidence in the industrial furnace used to burn medical waste, a convenient feature he had identified during his initial reconnaissance of the building. By the time staff discovered Clara's body later that morning, Van Eycken was at home, showered and changed, preparing for his next shift as if nothing had happened. The discovery of Clara's body finally triggered an investigation. The scene was too brutal, too obviously violent to dismiss as natural causes. Police were called. The retirement home was placed under scrutiny. Staff members were interviewed. Residents were questioned, though most were too confused or medicated to provide useful information. Van Eycken submitted to police questioning with the same bland cooperativeness he applied to all interactions. He expressed appropriate shock and horror. He claimed to have seen nothing, heard nothing, suspected nothing. He was just a maintenance worker, after all. What would he know about something like this? The investigation stalled almost immediately. There was no physical evidence linking any specific individual to the crime. Security footage was limited and poorly maintained. The cameras covered main entrances and common areas, but not individual rooms or side corridors. The retirement home's security systems were designed more to prevent residents from wandering off than to monitor staff activity. Weeks passed, then months. The investigation remained open but inactive, relegated to the cold case files that accumulate in every police department. Life at the retirement home returned to its grim routine. Staff turnover was high. Clara's murder had spooked many workers, and several quit rather than continue working in a facility where a killer might still be active. New employees were hired, most of them just as overtaxed and underpaid as their predecessors. And staff Van Eycken remained reliable and unremarkable, continuing his duties while planning his next kill. Because there would be more. The investigation had made him more cautious but not deterred. If anything, the challenge of killing under increased scrutiny only heightened his excitement. He had tasted blood, and he would taste it again. The retirement home continued to house vulnerable populations, and he continued to have access to them. The system had failed to protect Clara, just as it had failed Marie and Joseph. Van Eycken understood that this pattern would continue because institutions like the retirement home existed in a state of perpetual crisis. Understaffed, underfunded, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of human need. In such environments, monsters could thrive undetected, feeding on the vulnerable while bureaucracy and indifference provided cover. The vampire of Muizen was learning, adapting, perfecting his craft. And the body count was about to rise dramatically, because staff Van Eycken had discovered something terrifying. He enjoyed the killing almost as much as the blood. The fear in their eyes, the desperate struggle, the moment when resistance faded and death claimed another victim. These elements had become as addictive as the blood itself. He stood at a threshold. Behind him lay 3 murders, each one bolder than the last. Ahead lay more victims, more blood, more opportunities to satisfy the hunger that defined his existence. The retirement home was his domain, his hunting preserve, and no one suspected that the friendly maintenance worker was actually a predator unlike any they had encountered before. Winter deepened outside, bringing with it the longest nights of the year. Perfect hunting weather. Van Eycken had already selected his next victim, an elderly man on the 3rd floor, isolated and forgotten, whose death would barely register as noteworthy. The planning had begun. The ritual would repeat, and somewhere in Muizen, someone would die screaming into a pillow while staff Van Eycken drank their life away, one mouthful at a time. By the spring of 1994, staff Van Eycken had killed 4 people, though authorities wouldn't connect all the deaths until much later. Each murder had refined his technique, building his confidence while simultaneously feeding an appetite that grew more voracious with every victim. The intervals between kills shortened from months to weeks to days. What had begun as calculated predation was evolving into something approaching compulsion. His 4th victim was a man named Albert, a 76-year-old former teacher whose mind remained sharp even as his body deteriorated from emphysema and congestive heart failure. Albert was different from the previous victims. He was more aware, more present, more likely to resist. This made him dangerous, but it also made him more appealing to Van Eycken. The predator in him craved not just blood but the hunt itself, the challenge of subduing prey that might fight back. Van Eycken entered Albert's room on a Thursday evening, after dinner but before the night shift fully took over. This was a transitional period when responsibility for patient care existed in an ambiguous space between departing and arriving staff. In these gaps, oversight faltered. Van Eycken had learned to exploit these temporal blind spots with surgical precision. Albert looked up from the book he was reading when Van Eycken entered. Recognition flickered across his face. He had seen the maintenance worker around, had exchanged pleasantries, but something in Van Eycken's expression triggered alarm. The old man's eyes widened. His mouth opened to call for help. Van Eycken moved with shocking speed, crossing the room in 3 strides and clamping his hand over Albert's mouth. The old man struggled, his hands clawing at Van Eycken's arm, his body writhing with desperate energy. But emphysema had weakened him, stolen his breath and his strength. His resistance lasted less than 30 seconds before exhaustion overwhelmed him. The knife appeared in Van Eycken's free hand. He pressed the blade against Albert's throat, not cutting yet but applying enough pressure to communicate absolute intent. Albert's eyes met his, and Van Eycken saw fear transform into understanding. The old man knew he was going to die, knew that nothing he did or said would change that outcome. The resignation that followed was almost peaceful. Van Eycken made the first cut slowly, deliberately, watching Albert's face as the blade penetrated skin and found the carotid artery. Blood spurted with arterial pressure, hot and bright red, splashing against Van Eycken's chest. He lowered his mouth to the wound immediately, catching the pulsing flow, drinking deeply while Albert's struggles resumed with the manic energy that precedes death. The taste was extraordinary, richer somehow, more potent. Van Eycken would later reflect that fear altered the flavor of blood, made it more vital, more satisfying. He drank until Albert stopped moving, until the heart ceased pumping and blood flow reduced to a passive seep. Only then did he pull away, gasping, feeling the familiar euphoria wash over him. But something was different this time. The satisfaction lasted a shorter duration. Within hours, Van Eycken felt the hunger returning, more intense than ever before. It was as if his body had developed a tolerance, requiring larger and more frequent doses to achieve the same effect. This realization should have concerned him, but instead it only reinforced his sense of inevitability. He was what he was. Fighting it was futile. Surrender was the only option. He killed again 3 days later. The victim was a woman named Sophia, an 81-year-old widow who had lived at the retirement home for 5 years. Van Eycken barely knew her, had selected her almost at random based on opportunity rather than careful planning. The hunger was driving him now, dictating his actions with increasing urgency. Sophia's murder was messier, more violent. Van Eycken attacked her in the bathroom, where she had gone to prepare for bed. He caught her from behind, dragging her into the shower stall where blood could flow freely down the drain, simplifying cleanup. He cut her repeatedly, arms, legs, throat, chest, opening multiple wounds to maximize blood flow. He drank from each cut, moving frantically from one to another, trying to satisfy the craving that consumed him. When he finally stopped, Sophia's body lay crumpled in the shower, the water still running, diluting her blood and washing it toward the drain. Van Eycken stood there for several minutes, catching his breath, trying to reassert control over himself. He was losing discipline, he realized. The careful planning that had characterized his early kills was giving way to impulsive violence. This was dangerous. This would get him caught. But even as he recognized the risk, he knew he couldn't stop. The hunger was too strong, too fundamental. It had become the organizing principle of his existence, overriding reason and self-preservation. He was a slave to it, and that slavery felt more real than freedom ever had. Sophia's body was discovered the next morning by a nurse making rounds. The scene was shocking even by the standards of the previous murders. Blood everywhere, the violence unmistakable, the brutality impossible to rationalize. Police were called immediately. The investigation, which had languished after Clara's death, was reinvigorated with new resources and renewed urgency. Detectives began connecting the deaths, recognizing patterns they had missed before. The retirement home became the focus of intense scrutiny. Every staff member was re-interviewed. Background checks were conducted. Work schedules were analyzed to determine who had been present during each murder. A profile began to emerge. Someone with access, someone familiar with the facility, someone who could move through the building without attracting attention. Van Eycken felt the noose tightening but couldn't stop himself. He killed again 10 days after Sophia, selecting a man named Thomas whose only crime was being alone and vulnerable at the wrong moment. This murder was different. Van Eycken was beginning to experiment, to explore variations in his method. He strangled Thomas first, cutting off oxygen and inducing unconsciousness before making the incisions. This approach was quieter, less likely to attract attention, and it gave him more time to drink without interference. Thomas's blood tasted different. Something about the strangulation altered its chemistry, gave it a slightly bitter undertone that Van Eycken found intriguing. He was developing a connoisseur's palate, learning to detect subtle variations in flavor based on how his victims died, what medications they took, even what they had eaten for their last meal. This knowledge disgusted him on some level, but it also fascinated him. He was becoming expert in something no one else understood, accumulating dark wisdom that set him apart from normal humanity. The investigation was closing in, though Van Eycken didn't know how close. Police had narrowed their suspect pool to fewer than a dozen staff members who had been present during all the murders. Van Eycken was on that list, but so were several others. He wasn't a primary suspect yet, but he was being watched more carefully. His movements were being tracked. His background was being scrutinized in ways that would eventually reveal inconsistencies and red flags. But before police could gather enough evidence to make an arrest, Van Eycken killed again. And again. The murders came with increasing frequency, one per week, then multiple per week. He was spiraling out of control, his carefully maintained facade crumbling under the weight of his compulsions. Staff members began to whisper among themselves, speculation growing that one of their colleagues was responsible. Some refused to work night shifts. Others quit outright, unwilling to continue in an environment that felt increasingly dangerous. The retirement home was imploding. Families began removing their relatives, transferring them to other facilities. Admissions dropped to zero. No one wanted to send their loved ones to a place where murder had become routine. The institution itself was dying, collapsing under the weight of Van Eycken's atrocities. His final kill at the retirement home was a woman named Helena, 90 years old, blind and mostly deaf, existing in a sensory deprivation that made her presence almost ghostly. Van Eycken entered her room on a Tuesday afternoon, in broad daylight, no longer bothering with the careful timing that had characterized his earlier murders. He was past caution now, operating on instinct and hunger alone. Helena didn't struggle. She never even realized what was happening. Van Eycken cut her throat efficiently, drinking quickly, knowing that time was limited. He was mid-feeding when a nurse entered the room for a routine check. For a frozen moment, they stared at each other. Van Eycken with blood covering his face, the nurse with her hand over her mouth, horror paralyzing her. Then she screamed, and Van Eycken ran. He bolted from the room, down the corridor, past other staff members who were rushing toward the scream. Some tried to stop him, but he shoved them aside with manic strength. He reached the stairs and descended 3 floors in seconds, crashing through the ground floor exit and into the parking lot. His car was there, an aging sedan that would blend into traffic perfectly. He climbed in, started the engine, and drove away from the retirement home for the last time. Behind him, chaos erupted. Police were called. Descriptions were broadcast. A manhunt began. But Van Eycken had a head start, and he used it. He didn't go home. That would be the first place they'd look. Instead, he drove to a section of Muizen he knew well, an area of older buildings and narrow streets where someone could disappear if they knew where to look. He abandoned his car in an alley and continued on foot, moving through the municipality like a rat through a maze. He found temporary refuge in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building had once housed textile machinery but now stood empty, windows broken, roof partly collapsed. It was cold and exposed, but it offered concealment. Van Eycken huddled in a corner, his clothes still damp with Helena's blood, and tried to formulate a plan. But there was no plan. No escape route he hadn't already considered and rejected as impractical. The retirement home had been his hunting ground, his sanctuary, the only environment where he could satisfy his hunger without immediate consequences. Without access to vulnerable victims, without the infrastructure that had enabled his crimes, he was just a man, hunted, desperate, and running out of options. The hunger gnawed at him constantly now, a physical pain that radiated through his body. He needed blood, needed it with an intensity that bordered on madness. But obtaining it had become exponentially more difficult. He couldn't return to the retirement home. He couldn't target anyone in a way that wouldn't immediately draw attention. He was trapped between his compulsion and the impossibility of satisfying it. 2 days passed in that warehouse. Van Eycken survived on rainwater collected in debris and didn't eat at all. Food held no interest when what he truly craved was unavailable. He could hear sirens in the distance, could imagine police scouring the municipality for him. His face would be on the news by now, his identity revealed, his crimes catalogued in horrifying detail. On the third day, hunger drove him back into the streets. He couldn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, he would have to act, would have to find a victim somehow. The alternative, surrender or starvation, was unthinkable. He had come too far, killed too many, to simply give up now. He stalked through Musen streets after dark, looking for opportunity. The municipality felt different now, hostile, alert, dangerous. People glanced at him with suspicion. He realized his appearance was drawing attention. Disheveled, unwashed, wearing clothes stained with blood. He looked like what he was, a monster barely clinging to human form. Near midnight, he spotted a potential victim. A woman walking alone, carrying groceries from a late-night shop. She was young, perhaps 30, distracted by her phone. Van Eycken followed her, maintaining distance, waiting for the right moment. She turned down a residential street lined with parked cars and shadowed doorways. Perfect. Van Eycken accelerated his pace, closing the gap between them. The woman sensed something, glancing back nervously. Their eyes met. She recognized him. His face had been plastered across every news broadcast for days. Recognition became terror. She ran. Van Eycken pursued. The chase lasted less than a block before he caught her, tackling her to the pavement. She screamed, the sound echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Lights came on in nearby houses. Van Eycken produced his knife, raising it above her throat, preparing to cut, and stopped, because surrounding him were police officers, weapons drawn, shouting commands. They had been tracking him, had spotted him on security cameras, had followed him to this moment. His hunt had ended not with a kill but with capture. Van Eycken froze, the knife still raised, his victim sobbing beneath him. For a moment, he considered finishing what he'd started. One last taste of blood before they took him. But survival instinct overrode hunger. He dropped the knife and raised his hands in surrender. They dragged him off the woman with brutal efficiency. Hands forced him to the ground, knee pressing into his back, handcuffs biting into his wrists. Officers surrounded him, weapons still trained on his head, as if he were something more than human, something that might explode into violence at any moment. Van Eycken didn't resist. The hunger still clawed at him, demanding satisfaction, but he knew this chapter had ended. The retirement home, the easy victims, the months of feeding freely, all of it was finished. Reality crashed down with suffocating weight. He was caught. It was over. They hauled him to his feet and pushed him toward a waiting police car. Neighbors had emerged from their homes, watching the spectacle with expressions mixing relief and revulsion. The woman he'd attacked was being comforted by officers, her tears visible even from a distance. Van Eycken felt nothing looking at her. She was food he hadn't consumed. Nothing more. The interrogation began within hours of his arrest. Detectives who had been pursuing him for months finally sat across from the vampire of Muizen, studying the man who had terrorized their community. What they saw disappointed them on some fundamental level. Van Eycken looked ordinary, middle-aged, average build, unremarkable features. There was no visible mark of evil, no obvious indication of the monster lurking beneath his skin. But when they began questioning him about the murders, the monster revealed itself. Van Eycken confessed almost immediately, though not out of remorse. He simply saw no point in denial. They had caught him in the act. Physical evidence linked him to multiple crime scenes. His guilt was established beyond any reasonable doubt. Confession was simply efficiency. What disturbed investigators most wasn't the admission of guilt, but the manner in which he described his crimes. Van Eycken spoke about murder the way other people discussed hobbies, with enthusiasm, with detailed knowledge, with something approaching pride. He explained his selection process, his methods, the specific techniques he'd developed for maximizing blood extraction. He described drinking from his victims while they died, the taste and texture of their blood, the euphoria it produced. One detective left the interrogation room to vomit. Another requested reassignment, unable to continue participating in interviews with someone so fundamentally inhuman. Van Eycken noticed their reactions with detached curiosity, as if studying specimens rather than fellow human beings. Their revulsion meant nothing to him. They couldn't understand what he'd experienced. The transcendence of those moments when blood flowed freely and hunger was temporarily satisfied. Over subsequent days, the full scope of his crimes emerged. Van Eycken confessed to at least 6 murders at the retirement home, though investigators suspected the actual number was higher. Some deaths originally attributed to natural causes were reopened for examination. Bodies were exhumed. Autopsy reports were reviewed with new understanding of what to look for. The final count would never be definitively established, but estimates ranged from 8 to 12 victims. Each confession brought new horror. Van Eycken described elderly victims who couldn't defend themselves, who trusted him because he wore the uniform of a caregiver. He detailed the planning that went into each kill, the observation periods, the identification of opportunity, the careful timing. He explained his cleanup methods, his techniques for avoiding detection, his exploitation of systemic failures that allowed him to kill repeatedly without consequence. The retirement home's administration faced immediate scrutiny. How had this happened? How had a serial killer operated within their facility for months without detection? Investigations revealed systematic failures, inadequate staff training, insufficient background checks, poor security systems, overwork that led to diminished vigilance. The institution's reputation was destroyed. Within 6 months, it would close permanently, unable to recover from the association with Van Eycken's atrocities. The trial of Staff Van Eycken began in November 1994, 6 months after his arrest. The proceedings took place in a courtroom packed with journalists, family members of victims, and curious onlookers drawn by the sensational nature of the crimes. Security was unprecedented. Armed officers lined the walls, metal detectors screened everyone entering, and Van Eycken himself appeared in restraints, shackled at wrists and ankles. He looked different from the maintenance worker who had moved invisibly through the retirement home. Incarceration had hollowed him out. Weight loss sharpened his features. His skin had taken on an unhealthy pallor from months without sunlight. His eyes, which once projected bland normality, now held something vacant and distant, as if the essential part of him had retreated somewhere unreachable. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Physical evidence linked Van Eycken to multiple crime scenes, blood spatter patterns, DNA traces, fingerprints. Testimony from staff members established his presence during each murder. Security footage, limited though it was, showed him entering and leaving victims' rooms at relevant times. His own confession provided details only the killer could know. But the prosecution wanted more than conviction, they wanted understanding. They needed the jury to comprehend not just what Van Eycken had done, but why. To that end, they called psychiatric experts who had evaluated the defendant during his pretrial detention. Dr. Henrik Vandermeer, a forensic psychiatrist with 30 years of experience, testified about Van Eycken's psychological profile. He described a condition he termed clinical vampirism, or Renfield syndrome, an obsessive fascination with blood that could escalate to consumption and violence. Van Eycken, he explained, exhibited a textbook case. Childhood animal cruelty, progressive escalation of violent fantasies, eventual targeting of human victims, and the development of ritualistic behaviors around blood consumption. The defendant, Dr. Vandermeer, told the court, experiences blood as we might experience essential nutrition. He doesn't want it, he needs it. This need has become so fundamental to his psychological functioning that deprivation causes genuine distress, comparable to starvation or withdrawal from addictive substances. The testimony prompted an obvious question. If Van Eycken suffered from a mental illness, could he be held fully responsible for his actions? The defense certainly argued this position. Van Eycken's attorney, a public defender named Marcus Thielmans, who had drawn this assignment through bureaucratic lottery, presented evidence of his client's disturbed psychology. He introduced medical records showing treatment for depression and anxiety. He highlighted Van Eycken's social isolation, his difficulty forming normal relationships, his lifelong struggle with impulses he couldn't control or even fully articulate. But the prosecution countered with evidence of premeditation and planning. Van Eycken hadn't killed in moments of uncontrollable passion. He had stalked his victims, studied their routines, selected optimal moments for attack. He had taken steps to avoid detection, cleaning crime scenes and disposing of evidence. These actions demonstrated awareness of wrongdoing, understanding of consequences, and deliberate attempts to evade justice. Legal insanity, the prosecution argued, required inability to distinguish right from wrong. Van Eycken knew his actions were wrong. He simply didn't care. The testimony of surviving staff members proved particularly damaging. They described Van Eycken's demeanor in the days and weeks following murders. Calm, collected, utterly normal. He had continued his duties without any visible sign of guilt or distress. He had attended victims' funerals, maintaining his facade of concerned employee while privately savoring memories of their deaths. One nurse testified about discovering Van Eycken mid-attack, the moment that finally ended his killing spree. She described the scene in Helena's room, the elderly woman's blood pooling on the bed. Van Eycken crouched over her with his mouth pressed to her throat, his face transformed by an expression of ecstasy that haunted the nurse's nightmares. He looked happy, she told the court, her voice breaking, like someone enjoying a fine meal. He wasn't angry or upset. He was satisfied. Family members of victims delivered impact statements that reduced the courtroom to tears. Children described losing parents who were already vulnerable, whose final days should have been spent in safety rather than terror. Siblings mourned brothers and sisters who had trusted the system to protect them. Spouses grieved partners whose deaths had been dismissed as natural until the truth emerged. One woman, the daughter of Marie, Van Eycken's first confirmed victim, addressed him directly. "You took my mother from me," she said, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. She was 84 years old, suffering from dementia, completely helpless. And you murdered her. You drank her blood like she was livestock. I hope you understand what you've taken from us. Not just her life, but our peace, our ability to trust, our sense that the world makes sense. You destroyed all of that." Van Eycken listened to these statements without visible emotion. He sat motionless, staring at a point somewhere above the judge's head, his expression blank. Occasionally, observers noticed his throat working, as if he were swallowing. Those who understood the significance of this gesture, the involuntary response to thinking about blood, found it deeply disturbing. Even now, even facing life imprisonment, his primary thought was hunger. The defense called Van Eycken himself to testify, a risky decision that ultimately backfired. Attorney Thielmans hoped that allowing the jury to hear directly from his client might generate some sympathy, some understanding of the psychological forces that drove him. Instead, Van Eycken's testimony confirmed every horror the prosecution had alleged. He described his crimes with clinical detachment, explaining his methods and motivations without any apparent awareness of how his words sounded. He talked about selecting victims, about the qualities he looked for: vulnerability, isolation, low likelihood of immediate discovery. He discussed blood consumption as if it were a legitimate dietary preference rather than an act of profound violation. When asked about the victim's suffering, Van Eycken seemed genuinely confused by the question. "They were old," he said. "They were dying anyway. I simply accelerated what was already happening." Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, Remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.